Welcome to our Japanese style living environment webinar series. We'll soon be in conversation with Jay Van Arsdale about Japanese style wood joinery carpentry. Thank you for joining us. And special thanks to our partners who make this programming possible. The Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership and the Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association. My name is Peter Boyer, your moderator. I'm pleased to introduce Jay Van Arsdale. Jay Van Arsdale will show and tell about the art and craft of woodworking in Japan, tools, techniques, and the built environment of a traditional Japanese living environment. Jay is a building contractor in Oakland, California, USA, with a Master of Fine Arts degree. He received his early training in Japanese tools and joinery from the master temple carpenter Makoto Imai. Since the 1980s, Jay has taught Japanese joinery and tool use to hundreds of students in the San Francisco Bay Area at Laney and Merritt colleges and the Arguez School of Boat Building in Sausalito, California. Jay is known to wider audiences in North America and Japan for his book, Shoji, Designing, Building, and Installing Japanese Screens, published 1986 by Kodansha. For his video introduction to Japanese woodworking, 1987 film, and his contributions to the Complete Japanese Joinery, 1969 by Cloud Press. His magazine publications, seminars, and television appearances in the US and Japan are too numerous to list here. Jay is also the founder of Daiku Dojo, a Japanese woodworking group. You can learn more at daikudojo.org. Let me spell it. DAIKUDOJO.org. I have to let them talk. And so forth and so on. So there's the overhead view of Jay's hands right there. And then I can just go over here and I can do this. I can go to.
This is through Zoom now.
Yeah. Yeah, the meeting's actually started. There's the man, Jay Van Arsdale. And what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to kick it off. I'm going to try and show this little photo. Okay. Okay, everyone, welcome. My name is Peter Boyer. I'll be your host for this free webinar in the series on the Japanese style living environment. Why a series on the Japanese style living environment? Some of you may have heard this before, but we're in a time of flux and we're looking for new solutions to things like dwindling resources, carbon footprint, and also a way to we're looking for a balm to the stresses of modern urban life as well. And we do very well to look around the world at the diversity of cultures and learn from other people's experimentation rather than, you know, just trying to go it alone. So there's a lot of rugged individualists right now on the unemployment lines, and they're all looking like scared sheep being herded around by demagogues to me. So this is what real rugged resourcefulness looks like. You humble yourself and you go learn from others. So today's speaker indeed traveled over the ocean and apprenticed with, you know, an accomplished master in an obscure craft in a faraway land. Come back to this country like kind of like one of those Old Testament prophets wandering out of the desert. He's got a message that might prove useful. So let's find out. So who's behind all this webinar stuff? This webinar is being produced by the Oakland-Fukuoka Sister City Association here in Oakland, California, USA. And that's just one of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sister city organizations around the world. And the one in Oakland has a relationship with the city of Fukuoka in Japan, in the island of Kyushu. And the OFSCA, for short, we got a lot of folks who've had prior experience in Japan in various capacities and wanna keep that relationship alive. And the two cities also have a lot of similarities. They both have a major port, and they collaborate at that level as well. And every year, Oakland hosts an exchange student from Fukuoka, lives with family here, goes to school here, and we send high schoolers over there as well. Oakland also coordinates 4th and 5th graders going to the Asia Pacific Children's Convention hosted in Fukuoka every year. So this is from all the islands of the Pacific all the way down to India. So this is kind of the vision of the Sister Cities movement, is to create enough international exchange that we all come to understand and appreciate one another. And hopefully that'll come in handy when times get rough and tensions rise. And, you know, we have lots of people who actually know the other side. It's so much easier to resolve a conflict when you're acquainted. So enough for the Sister Cities movement, and thanks to former General and President Eisenhower for inspiring it. The entire series is funded by the Japan Foundation. So this is the nation of Japan as their foundation, and they're very interested in offering their accumulated wisdom and their knowledge to other people who are interested. And so thank you for your interest. There's over 100 people registered for today's event. And we're very happy to meet you. And then momentarily, we're going to be meeting Jay Van Arsdale. So who is Jay Van Arsdale? Well, he's going to tell you all about it. I just want to say that I first encountered Jay Van Arsdale 15 years ago because in the capacity as a volunteer in the greater San Francisco Bay Area at numerous public Japanese home and garden, parks. I founded a similar class series at one of them, and Jay was gracious enough to drive all the way over there and offer a talk on this topic as well. And since then, he's really become involved in many of the gardens and estates that I was volunteering in. And so his works are publicly accessible. Jay also has been teaching a course in this traditional wood joinery for many a year at one of our local community colleges, which is a great place to go to get plugged in to a particular area of interest, by the way, how I started. And Jay has legions of former students, and they're organized in a group. It's very important to join a group because that's where the connections. You're wondering who does what? Well, how are you going to find out? You can't ask around. You don't know who to ask. And lastly, woodworkers who are knowledgeable in the Japanese style of traditional woodworking are organized in a nonprofit as well. And Jay will fill you in, but they're officially recognized as being major league by the Woodworkers Federation in Japan. So there's one here on the North American continent. So there's another way, if after this you're inspired to learn more or get involved. I hope you were taking notes because I just told you all about that. And Jay will be happy to answer any further questions in detail. So I think everyone's been thanked and Jay's been introduced. And here we go. Hello, Jay.
Thanks, Peter. That was a mouthful you said there. Excuse me, even with the mask on. That's the way things are these days, folks. I don't know. It seems like webinars are going to be a big thing in the future since we can't get together. I myself had a little problem with this at first because it wasn't really hands-on and face-to-face, but realizing what we've got, this is the best we can got, and actually it's a pretty amazing technology. So I'm hoping we can expand our conversation and our friendship and learn about each other and what we're doing here. I got involved with this in the middle 1970s when I stumbled into a demonstration by a Japanese tea house carpenter. His name was Makoto Imai. He was one of the first Japanese carpenters to come over to this country in the 70s. There were other carpenters that came earlier with the immigrants from Japan. I've worked on a few of the jobs around the Bay Area that they've done, restoring and fixing them after 50 or 60 or 70 years. But it wasn't really something that caught on. What I'm basically talking about is a pre-industrial mindset. It has its own efficiencies, it has its own cultures, it has its own sources, and its aesthetics are very tied into nature and the quality of natural products. I grew up on a small farm. My family blacksmiths since after the American Revolution. So I grew up in a shop learning how to learn by watching. So that was really, looking back at it, that was really an important thing to learn because most of the time you're learning from reading books and memorizing things. This was a more hands-on things. So what we're trying to do here is to give you a little more insight into that. After I got out of high school, I went to college in Kentucky, and while I was at Center College in Danville, I was lucky that we had a Belgian sculptor that was on the campus, and I got to work with him for 3 years and ended up being his assistant, and we made a bronze sculpture that's on the campus at the campus now. That was really a complete learning experience on the totality of what you were trying to do. It wasn't little pieces here and there that you had to put together and connect the dots. So that kind of hands-on learning, I think, really is important with what other kind of learnings you're doing. We have to read books and watch videos and do those kind of things. But again, you need to get your body involved with this if you really want to, I think, understand it on a deeper level. That's not always what people are really interested in, too, getting that far into it. The problem with this kind of craft is that it's not a casual craft. You have to get really involved with a lot of processes to feel like you're being able to be express what you want to express and get through the awkwardness of your body that's not used to being disciplined like this. One of the things I think that's really important with all this Japanese stuff is that their culture has pretty much mandated that they keep these trades and skills alive, because in their constitution they have to maintain all these old ancient wooden structures that are all national treasures. So those buildings and structures can only be worked on with people who know how to fix things and build things the way they were then with the tools they only had then. So a lot of the temples they can't even use the hand saws on because they were built before hand saws were evolved to a really usable tool in like the 1500s. That was one of the last tools that was developed because of the techniques and skills they had to develop to make the steel and be able to draw it out to such a thin level, making it flexible enough to be able to use and brittle and hard enough to be able to make teeth that stayed sharp. So it's a real like a paradox there on how you do that. And those people that do that are, they're masters in their own trade, and this kind of stuff is passed down through generations. It's not that one person figured out everything. It's a cumulative effect. So again, what I draw from in my interest is what's been retained of all these old techniques and things that are, back to really the most basic things. And I kind of like to follow through what I call like an evolution of practicality, starting with the most basic, simple tools you might have. The Japanese obviously were building something before 600 AD when Buddhism came into China with the temples, which was like their main propaganda. I mean, still incredible propaganda. But in all that time, since then, they've incorporated a lot of the seeds of creativity that they got from the Chinese. Like they got, the building ideas and the bracket systems and all this, which the Chinese had gotten years before. They came from China came to China from India when Buddhism came in from India. So there were these different waves of different kinds of design and construction, which I won't get into. People know a whole lot more about that. But what I want to kind of focus on today is going back to some of the most basic processes and tools that they used and they developed in this evolution of practicality. As soon as they learned something, they found out some use for it and they tried to make it. So, the thing that they're probably one of the most things they're most famous for is the laminated steel that they make, which is a combination of a hard steel called higani and a softer steel called jigani. Usually now the soft steel, the tool makers like to use old anchor chains and things that were made of iron. So the soft steel is an iron substance, which means that it doesn't have a lot of carbon in it. So as soon as they smelt the iron ore, which is actually a sand that comes out of the rivers, with charcoal, the charcoal puts the carbon into the steel and makes it, the carbon goes into the iron, which makes the steel, which is something that's able to be tempered and sharpened. Iron itself is not really a sharpenable material. So a lot of this was really developed during the warring years that they had plenty of for making swords and halberds and all this kind of stuff. So when they finally settled down and moved the capital to Kyoto, the warlords had to all move into Kyoto, build houses and temples, and that was the way that they converted the war into a peace dividend. So most of what was built in Kyoto was built during that period by people who were trained into doing this. And the tool makers were sword makers who learned how to make saws and chisels and the plane blades. Those are all like sword maker techniques that were involved into some of the most incredible sharp tools around still. So it's really an interesting evolution to see how they combined all these things and the missing elements were developed to help them move on to other levels. So like I said, if you got access to some of the more historical books that show you the evolution of the styles, it has to do with some very recognizable features that are on these buildings, from simplicity of the construction to more complicated bracket systems, which were a cantilevered system that actually was projecting the eaves out past the buildings so the rain didn't hit the mud walls and dissolve the mud walls. It had to do with that. So all these things that were solved weren't a one focused thing. It did that, but also it added grace and proportion to the buildings. So all these things had a very practical application in how they developed the systems to be able to cantilever these heavy roofs, sometimes out 15 or 18 feet from the building. So some of them sagged, they had to come in and do rework, but again, it was like analyzing your failures to find out what's going to make it better. The guys that built all these weren't architects and separate people. They were the head of the carpentry crew. The temple builders are, a very select group who, have a whole lifetime of work and study and knowing just the most intricate details of things that are really unimaginable to most people. So we still have those around. And they're still working, and they're still working in Japan, but the whole system has changed from the carpenters being monks at each temple doing maintenance, and that was their spiritual work, to where now a lot of these are run by companies who call in different craftsmen from all over Japan to work on specific sites of specific techniques and with the tools that are required, at that point when the building was built. So again, I think that's really something that has preserved this whole thing, because it is a culture of tradition. At the same time, they're going to the moon. They've got AI and robots and really unbelievable technology. So there's a lot of things in Japan. It's like blind people feeling up an elephant. One sees a tree trunk, one feels a rope. So everybody comes to Japan from different reasons and finds more than they probably thought about. I know that was true for me. So what we're talking about is wooden construction. It kind of follows Western timber framing. A lot of differences in that when you start looking at how the preparation is, how the construction is, how they're thought about for longevity. One of the biggest things that I realized when I got more familiar with all this was the care that they took with their trees and the lumber that they were going to build with. Traditionally, the temples owned this, or the government owned the forest, and then later on, the common folks took over the forest, and they were able to help their economics by selling the trees to the middlemen who managed to get all the lumber together for a temple. If you've seen these temples, it's unbelievable how big they are and how much lumber is in there. And myself having done some of this work, it's astounding how they even got all the lumber together. I mean, it's a forest, which I think was one of the reasons when they changed capitals. There was political stuff involved, but they also decided to move other places because they cut most of the big trees down, and it was too much trouble to to move these big logs and stuff out of the mountains, which I think eventually led to, maybe in the later 15th, 16th centuries, when they developed a lot of the really intricate splicing joints, because they could bring down smaller, shorter logs and then have ways to put the joinery back into them that made them as strong as the original timbers and beams. I mean, it's really an ingenious system that we'll look at here in a minute. So, all these things work together. They had fires and peace and famine, and they had wars forever. And then I don't know. It's pretty amazing how things even are still standing after all that. But again, some of the oldest, biggest used wooden buildings in the world are in Japan, and they're open every day. Probably not today because of the virus, but in general they are. So what we're talking about here first is wood, which this is a section of a tree trunk. You can see that this is the inside of the cambium layer where the bark has been taken off. That's a whole trade in Japan. They take the bark off the trees even when they use the log with the natural, because insects and things get under the bark and they don't want to carry those in the house. Hinoki, which is like our Port Orford cedar, is a white cedar that they use pretty much strictly for temples. They have trees that they grow that they strip the bark off that they use for roof shingles. It lasts probably as long as anything you could put on a roof, and it's a different thing than American shingles because most of these are on temples. They have a lot of curves and movement in them, so they split the shingles off really thin, so they wet them and soak them, and then they can bend them around all these curves, and they're nailed on with little bamboo nails. If you put a metal nail in there, which they didn't have a lot of extra metal nails back in the old days, it would rust really quick and it wouldn't hold up long. So again, when you don't have the metal in there, there's no rust going on because the wood works okay with itself for a long time. These those kind of roofs last really, it's one of the 3 or 4 major kinds of roofs, especially on temples where there's a lot of curves. You can't bend things around curves like that unless they're really thin. So this is a redwood stump. This is the outside face of the tree. In tea house construction, Riku started making rustic structures, small structures, just leaving the rough. This isn't rough, it's very smooth and sensual actually, but leaving it unfinished is part of the aesthetics of the tea house. Uh, that was probably him in the tea ceremony. That was probably a big thing that ended up moving into the residential living as a sukiya or skiya style building, which is based on more natural materials, not so much lumbered up square materials, clay walls, a lot of bamboo and natural materials. So, that's kind of one of the beautiful things that they recognized that they made a very high quality out of. So when you're looking at this, I don't know which one, you can see that you have the outside, which is the sapwood, and you have the heartwood. The Japanese would always take their logs, they put this kerf in here, which is called a kuwari. And what that does, it releases all the stress so that when this wood dries out, it doesn't crack because this crack opens up. So you got to realize that this wood is a living structure at one time with all these little straws or pipes running up and down carrying fluids. So as you cut the tree and it dies, that moisture leaves and all these little capillaries in there shrink. So that's where you get all the contortions in wood. So the Japanese do this. They might age this wood for a long time, 10 years, where we cut lumber in 6 weeks, it's a deck on somebody's porch, right? So there's a whole nother attitude toward this because they're building something that's going to last 1,000 years. You don't do that with 40-year-old Doug fir or high or whatever we're using. So anyway, this is one of the preparations they take. They dry this out. So again, one of the things that I found really different was that the Japanese it's almost demanded that when you're doing the accuracy and the kind of joinery they're doing, that the wood is cured and stable, which means that it's already dried and shrunk and twisted or whatever it is, so they know what's happening. Westerners, Europeans tend to use green oak as a general rule, and it's green because it's easier to cut and work with. And it's more brittle and tougher. So the buildings they're building are built with this green wood usually that shrinks and cracks and does all that, and they don't have any control. So the Japanese are much more control freaks about what they're putting into their lumber and into what they're going to use in their buildings. A building could have 10 different kinds of wood in it, depending on what the application was and what it needed. If you had a piece of real sappy pine, you might use that for the mud seal, which was down on the ground level, close to the moisture. If you got really clear, nice panels, then you'd use those for maybe ceiling panels. You got good straight Port Orford, you're going to make shoji out of those. So they knew every wood and what its qualities were, and was probably the best base to use it. I've worked in the trades for a while, and I never really found that to be the case. So I don't know, when I got into something much more sophisticated, it just intrigued me more because there was more refinements I could make in my work through myself and developing more skills and knowledge about what I could do that I didn't know that could be done. So I know when I saw a Dakota work and other guys, geez, you can do that. I didn't know you could. I want to do that, right? So it's like that was the curiosity thing that inspired me to start messing around with this. I never thought I was going to be whatever, but after 40 years of diligence, you realize there's been a lot of progressions, and the good work you got to do, the people you got to meet, the things you got to see and enjoy, are really fulfilling. So we're looking at this piece of wood. What I've got here is another little chunk. Okay. You got a piece of wood that looks like this. You see, trees grow round. They don't grow square, right? So when you cut pieces out of this, the way the grain is lined up in there is going to cause it to do different things. So basically, when you buy lumber, you're getting two kinds of cuts. One cut is square to the radial, to the growth lines, and the other one is a flat grain, right? So what I'm saying here is that if you cut the tree so that you're looking this way, what you're seeing is these lines going this way, then this board edge is going to have vertical grain, which kind of looks like this. You can see these straight lines here. Each one of those little lines, which you probably can't see on white wood here, is a year's growth. So each one of those rings is how much you grew in a year. That's dendrochronology. They can go all over the world and do that. If you cut it where it's called flat grain, which is like across the grain this way, so you're picking up the roundness, then you get a pattern that looks more like this, where you see the growth rings that hook into the vertical lines, right? So that's your two kinds of lines. One has better stability than the other because the way the vertical grain is kind of stacked like plywood. And when you lay it flat like this, you're looking at the other grain and you get this grain that picks up and moves a little bit. So, knowing which way to do that a lot of times is what's called for in some of the construction things. Usually when I build a lot of shoji, I like the frames to be vertical grain because that makes them more stable. And then I like panels to have more decorative parts in it because you get more grain action and the prettiness of it, right? So, that's basically kind of the wood talk here. So they had a tree. What they would do first was chop it down. They didn't have saws. They would take wedges and split these off because they could pick out the straightest grain, old growth trees that they could almost split boards out flat because the trees were old growth, which meant they grew in a forest inside and they didn't wobble in the wind. When trees wobble in the wind, they get all this reactionary wood to help strengthen them. Makes them stronger, but it makes the grain in there weird and it causes a lot of problems sometimes planing, which is the challenge when you start to plane this wood. So they would split that off. First they would probably do is take an adze. That looks kind of like this. And then they would use that to flatten the surface down. This tool, I don't know, I've seen pictures of things that look like this that were 5,000 years old. So this is like one of the oldest tools that they've developed because you get the mechanical advantage in the control. I know they had the Northwest Indians use things like this, and they had jade blades that they would use. I can't imagine a piece of stone getting sharp enough to cut wood, but that's what they say. So again, this is a traditional tool. You can tell because it's got the laminated steel. There's always on the beveled side, you see two colors of steel. You have a soft steel and a hard steel. That hard steel is the hard part that's always the cutting edge, right? So it's called sand mine construction, three pieces, because you got this hard piece in the middle and the softer piece is its shock absorber. So the real key to this is the steel plus the sharpening techniques and tools that they developed, the stones they developed, which were naturally occurring in Japan. So once they had that split out, then what they would do, it would be pretty flat. Their actual finished surface would be finished off with a tool called a Yari Gana, called a spear plane. I mean, you can see this came right off the battlefield, right? Somebody had a sharp sword, they were sharpening it, and they go, oh, look at this. So there's a lot of these different yariganas that you use, depending on the sweep of the blade. You start off with the one with more curve in it. All right, let's see if I can show you something. If you put, roll this down. This is used, again, this is an old tool. Before they had the planes that they developed. So wait, start off with this is a nice branch that I've made myself. This is a yarigana made by a famous guy in Japan. It's a laminated blade. It's back in there. You take it out so you can sharpen it. So it's sharp on both edges. So what you've got here is a leverage to pull shavings off. If you had a rough surface, you would flatten it down to this flatness with the bevel in this sweep. And then to finish it, you would come back with a yarigana that had less of a sweep, which would give you a flatter surface. So you never really get a flat surface, but you get a surface with some texture and a burnish on it because of the way the tool runs across the wood with pressure. So when you get to a spot with the grain change, you can go back the other way, but you're really trying to read this. I use this a lot just for texture. I can make things slick as a piece of glass, but sometimes this surface picks up a little raking light, which makes a really interesting kind of shadow pattern that you don't see when things are really smooth. So again, those kind of visual textures are very subtle developments that they incorporated using these tools into buildings that they traditionally, that's how they made them. So this was the surface. It wasn't some special effect. Now it's probably a special effect. But anyway, very interesting tool. Again, it doesn't work till it gets really sharp, which your first task as an apprentice is learning how to sharpen. It's very valuable for anything. So once they had their piece of wood, what they would do for drawing the lines for their layout, they would visualize their shapes. There's a few really basic shapes and techniques that develop all these intricate kind of joinery. So the interesting thing was the square that they used was a square looked like this. In the old days, they were made out of copper. This one's a new stainless steel one. It has their own scale. I use this myself. This is called shaku. It's a traditional Japanese measurement. It's a 10 scale they got from China. I'm not sure when the date was, but I know that when they first started building temples, they had to congregate all these people and feed them, put them up for while they were building the temple. The genius thing they did was they standardized the measurements. So they sent you a plan. You made the piece at home. You brought it over when you were done, and everything fit because you're all measuring with the same measurements. Each county or province would have its own size of washi, its own size of tatami, whatever, because it was a local thing. So once they branched out and became nationwide, one of the first things they did was set up this scale being the same thing. This 10 soon is a 1/16 of an inch less than 12 inches. So for me, it's the perfect thing. So it's 4 shaku. Well, that's 4 feet, more or less, right? It's not 927 centimeters. That gets, so it's divided into tenths. The soon are divided in, the shaku is divided into 10 soon. Each soon is divided into 10 bu, and each bu is divided into a half called a rin. So this is a total tool developed for laying out proportions. Doesn't matter, you can use inches or whatever you want to use. It's a matter of be able to control the proportions and making the fits right, because a lot of these fits are very intricate. So, I use this because it's much easier to lay things out off a center line. You're dividing things like you're counting money. You don't get any weird fractions that never come out to a full number, and all those little error points accumulate at the end, then you got some things there you didn't want to happen. So again, finding the right consistent layout is really something it's really necessary for this, and and important. So what they did was they used the Sashigani. It has shaku measurements on one side, and on the back scale, there's three different ones. One's the regular measurement. This measurement up here is called the Kakume scale, which is the front measurement multiplied by the square root of 2. What that tells you is the hypotenuse of a right triangle, right? An equilateral right triangle. So when you're laying out a hip rafter that's coming at a 45, that makes your triangle, so you know where all the spacing goes for the rafters coming in, because you know how to make those triangles. So all this construction is really based on a lot of triangles, understanding triangles for stability, triangles for projecting parts and all those kind of things. So it's really, it's a very mindful process. If they taught geometry like this to kids, I think it would be a lot more interesting. But again, it's a very complicated thing because, when you get, you've got basically three kinds of woodworkers building structures. You've got residential house builders. Traditionally, they built timber frame with some logs and nice things. You've got temple builders who are a whole nother trade and skill sets with all these curves and rolling ridge lines and all that geometry is laid out beforehand. And then you've got the tea house carpenters who are using more of the traditional, logs and natural materials and not so much things. So each one of those has its own skill sets that are demanded more or less by the kind of design they're doing and structure they're building, and the materials they're using really dictate a lot of that information. So this is a square Sashigani, like I said, and it's got another scale in here that you can measure the diagonal of a log, and it'll tell you how big of a square you can get out of it. So this one, looking over here, measured out, I could probably get, I don't know, 4 inches or so. So anyway, a lot of things. This is a carpenter's computer. People are trained to use this thing, do it like a dance, laying out stuff, knowing how to get the geometry and proportions of angles and all those. It's really a fascinating thing. I'm not an expert in that because my jobs don't really demand that I know I do that. I'm doing other things as traditional as I can, but when I lay out roof rafters and those kind of things, I'm not quite as fast and efficient as people who do it all the time. So it's one of those things. If you don't do it, you got to think about it too much. After you do it a lot, you don't have to think about it. You just do it, right? So the other tricky thing is they use a ink pot called a sumitsubo. It's got sumi ink, raw cotton with water and ink, and it's one of those things. It's not a casual thing. You got to use it a lot because the water dries out. You put too much ink, it clogs up. You put too much water, it's dripping all over. So this is a sumitsubo. It's got the carpenter's symbols of the turtle with the hair coming off its butt, long life, and then it's got the crane. So the crane and the turtle are the longevity and the dedication of your craft for your life. So ink pot there, it has an ink line that goes through the ink, so it's like a chalk line. You snap it, that gives you that really thin little black line, and it winds back up on that little wheel for storage. You're marking with a piece of bamboo. There's the outside of the bamboo that's split. This side's flattened down like a chisel and split like a quill pen. Got a straight edge and a sharp edge. How sharp that edge is the line that you're going to draw. This end's used it's more or less a brush where you could write, you're marking the waist or you got a name or something, you can write it with this end, right? So this and this and that, that's the carpenter's major emblems. All right. So what you've got here is this thing is split, and as you dab it into the top of the moisture in the ink, lay this across, you draw your line. the length, the width and the darkness of the line depends on getting the ink right in there, but also how much pressure you put on the line, but it gives you a very exact line. And the theory is when you're making the joinery is that you're trying to split that line and put the drawing back together in 3 dimensions, right? There's exceptions to that. So this is the black ink that's a carbon-based ink that's carbon from it's like kerosene lamps that burn different oils that make them smoke, and then they scrape that soot off and work it down into like a putty in different qualities and different things. You know, it's used for sumi painting. It's in little blocks for them. Usually what we're using comes as a liquid, and you know, you dump it on here and you put a little water till you get everything right. So primitive, can't get much simpler than this. Works great when I'm doing big stuff, laying out big things. This is the only thing I use. It'll lay on lines that a pencil or an ink pen won't keep up with, right? You got a lot of problems. So where this came from was something like this that I got from my friend Richard Wyborg, who's a Chinese bracket specialist. You got a little cup here, which your stuff would go in with hold the ink. You got your line coming through. You got your wind up in the back here, like a little fishing pole, right? Mm-hmm. And the thing that really tripped me out was this was all handmade. You can tell by looking at it. The spool here is split in half. I don't know if you can see that from here. Hold on. This is split in half. Why that does is this thread goes through the ink. After it gets wet for a while, it gets soft and it might rot off. So as you're working this down, coming to the end, then you go to this side, which has fresh string that hasn't got any ink on it. So it's there when you run out of ink, a line on the other side. Now, I don't know how old this is. It's not recent, I'm sure, but I don't think it's antique, but it could be antique just because of the way it's made. And I mean, the craftsmanship and using the bamboo, there's the bottom node. There's the bottom node of the bamboo, right? It's mortised into the top right here. Then you got your little fishing pole thing on the end that goes like this. So this would have been laid out like this in China for who knows how long. I mean, again, we're back to where, I don't know, there's not probably archaeological records and things, but still usable, still works, right? Interesting. I don't know. I mean, you know, so when you go from there, then you find out all kinds of things. I mean, you know, now when I'm doing very small stuff, I use a little mechanical pen. Much easier than that, especially on small stuff, but on big stuff, this one doesn't work so good. So whatever you're comfortable with, I mean, again, I start my students off, I don't get into that. It takes a while. It's so simple. Yeah, that's the thing. Japanese stuff is so simple, it's hard to do, right? I mean, that thing, you pick it up and draw a line. Well, you don't know how much time it took to get it to a point where it's going to draw that line. If you're doing it every day, it's there ready to go. But if you don't use it every day and it sits around and it dries out, and you got to deal with stuff. But anyway, so first we talked about a little wood, where the wood comes from. We talked about surfacing the wood. This was the yarigama. I don't know if you can see kind of the pattern, whatever pattern or texture is left on the surface. Kind of depends on what you're looking for. It can be a very flat, smooth thing. Sometimes I do it kind of deep and rutted, so it kind of looks like a peen surface. It's got more little wavelets in it, so it picks up light and reflects a little bit. I mean, it's really a subtle thing. When you start seeing light reflected in that kind of subtle thing, you're looking at different ideas, different textures of things than you normally would see. So modern things, they had chisels. The traditional Japanese chisel called nomi. All of them have a laminated steel blade. You can tell that by looking at the bevel. You got the silver and you got the gray. The gray is the soft steel. Different makers hollow grind the back, which takes away most of the material in the back, which in the old days made it much easier to sharpen this, so you didn't have to grind all the metal off the back. In the old days, these scoops were done, um, the scoops sometimes were just simple single scoops. Those were done when the metal had been made and annealed, right? It had been forged out of, say, Tamagani is the sword steel, the sand that comes out of the river. They smelt that in a Tamagani. If you're curious about that, I'm sure there's YouTube things that show the Tamagani. It's like a clay and bamboo hot tub that they burn huge amounts of carbon, charcoal in with the sword steel sand, and they burn it for like 2 or 3 days continuously, and it never gets molten. So when they stop and break the thing apart, there's this lava rock looking thing, and the people who know about this can tell how much carbon, how hard it will get by the color and the sheen of it. So obviously the best quality of that ingot, which could weigh like a ton. I mean, it's a big deal. The best quality that's taken out for highest quality samurai sword. As it goes down the list of not being top quality, which I don't know what all that has to do with, then you get into the good stuff that's in some of this, the handmade woodworking tools, some really probably expensive knives. There's not a lot of Tamagani being used in making the tools because it's so expensive. Uh, so one of the few things that's probably been added to this whole tradition in the last 50 years is probably some of the metallurgy that they've added into the steels. Now most, if not all, blacksmiths go to metallurgy school. In the old days, you learn by doing it and watching and being around it your whole life. It's not a bad thing, it's a different thing. So, they are trained to know how to do it, what to look for, all the different temperatures in terms of what they're making. The steel, when they get the steel, it's welded in a fire. The two pieces are welded together. There's a form that they make the chisel the right size. There's a lot of finishing. And once they got the shape there, and they anneal it, which makes it soft. So when it's soft, they can take what's called a sin, looks like a spoke shave, and they can scrape this out. They get the shape they want, they do all they want, then they put it back in the fire and they temper it, which brings out the carbon and lines it up in a position inside the iron molecule to give it steel to make the edge hold up. Now there's some metallurgy magic going on there that, these guys, the West didn't know about carbon until the middle of the 18th century. They'd already been making these high quality tools without knowing what carbon was for 100, 500 years or more. I don't know, way back then. They knew they had to have the charcoal in with the sword steel or it wouldn't work. So how we understand the chemistry and the metallurgy, they had whole other ways of imagining what was going on in there that were as valid as what we know, all our science and electron microscopes and all that kind of stuff. So again, how people know things and pass on that information is a nonverbal process. It's a hands-on thing. None of this was even written down probably till the middle of the 1800s. It was all family trade secrets. They told you they'd have to kill you. So they didn't talk about it a lot, right? So it was all these family secrets. Each maker of these tools has his own recipe for things, right? So I know there's been this guy's chisels that I bought when I first started. He went out of business because he got real old and sold his name. Another person was making the chisel with this name on it. It didn't work because it wasn't as good as the first one, and he had to do something else. So I mean, again, the chef changes, the food changes. Not that it gets better or worse, but they got different things they know about and different techniques, and sometimes it's what phase the moon's in. I know there are blades that are made in Japan only in the winter because the water is the right temperature. So I mean, again, it seems like not efficient way to work or think about things, but you look at what happened. I don't know what you can complain about, and they've maintained all those rigorous standards for all these times. Um, in the old days, when I started in the old days, there were a lot more middle quality chisels. Now a lot of those are gone. So there's some cheapy stuff, which is not really that inexpensive, but not the quality and the handwork and the expertise that goes into the upper level stuff. I don't know, this is a standard looking chisel. This chisel could cost $100. It could cost somebody else made it doing something else with different steel and different packing tricks they do with packing the molecules and all that at different temperatures. Could be $250. That worth it? I don't know. Maybe. Probably is. I know when I started, I didn't have any money. I was buying the least expensive things I could just to get a feel of it. And then I realized I wasn't making any progress, and I got a little more expensive chisel, and the whole thing changed. So there's all these progressions. I mean, you start off in Japan. We want all the answers. We want to be taught all the answers. In Japan, you got to learn. They don't tell you that answer. They don't tell you. Learn by watching. That's how I learned growing up, is watching. My dad didn't say, "Here, boy, do this, this, and this." He said, "Watch, boy." That was how I learned how to do things. And after a while, I knew what he was going to do. I anticipated. I could hand him the right tool or the bolt or whatever it was he needed, because I had gotten involved with the process. And it wasn't just something, intellectual. So, there's a lot of learning things here I see with my students. Very intelligent professional people, but their hands and their brain don't connect good, and that's part of, to me, the joy of getting them to realize a little bit of the function of their hands. I mean, these are some incredible things here. If you didn't have them, you'd be a stick in the mud. So anyway, now we're down to lumber. Let's look at, so again, you got the Yarigana surface, you got an edge surface. I know a couple of guys in Japan that are building traditional modern houses that are doing some of the most tasteful adzing work in beams and sort of things. I know I saw a picture of a house they built with these shojis that opened out looking over an Ingawa that looked out over a hill into the bay. And as you're looking at this, the floor had been adzed and it looked like rippling water. It was one of the most incredible, outstanding ideas I'd seen in a house that was really, amazing. Now, adzing is really hard. It looks easy. You're just chopping away at wood. Well, no, if you want a standard pattern, you've got to be very methodical about it. Not machine-like, but you got to be very methodical, because one chop's got to be like the other chop. They all got to be in line. So I'm sure when you recognize what I'm talking about in some pictures in books or houses that you know of, you see that, you appreciate where that surface came from. In the old days, they were hewing it down to make it a size. It wasn't, they weren't decorating it. That was how they, finished off what was the material for the house. So, again, we got a lot more options, and that you go for that would be an expensive option, but it'd be something I'm sure you looked at every day and just was in wonder at looking at it, because it's really something special. But again, when you know more about it, what it represents and the whole thing, all these dots connect together in Japanese living. It's the house, it's the shoji, it's the view, it's borrowing the scenery, it's the plantings, it's the trees, it's all this stuff, and there's this whole continuity of kind of making nature a little more accessible, in the lives of people, because the Japanese at that point traditionally lived very close to nature, like most people did, but they didn't try to get away from it like Western houses. Even up in the snow country, they still had, terrible winters like they had in Europe, but they didn't have stone buildings and, those kind of things. They toughed it out. The Koreans, for their sake, they had houses with heating vents that went under the floor. At least they heated their houses from the floor. So, there's a whole system of heating vents of hot air that moved under the floor that heated the house. The Japanese never bothered to do that. They just toughed it out. I mean, you see little school kids going to school in the snow and they got shorts on. Toughen them up, right? Don't baby those boys. They won't grow up to be cowboys. So we got our lumber here. Usually the process for me, all the machines I use in my work are just a table saw and a thickness planer to make boards. I don't no, I use any boards that I buy that are that size. The proportions wrong, or I buy big stuff and cut it down and all that. So after that, everything's done by hand. So when I've sawed up pieces, I usually run them through a thickness planer to kind of give me, the machines do that really good. I got enough energy to do everything else I want to do by hand. If I can get that out of the way, then I've already saved a lot of the extra physical work. So once it comes out of the machine, it might look like this, pretty good. I hand plane everything because that sets the dimensions that I want. Plus it tells me if there's weird things in the wood that aren't going to plane good. Then I can pay attention to those and have another strategy to deal with whatever that problem is. Usually it has to do with grain change, right? So I said, you're looking at grain, there's all these growth lines. Well, if they're going this way and you plane that way, then you're going to tear them out if your plane's not set up right, right? So what we got here is we got the wood set up. So I've got, these are Kanna, K-A-N-N-A. This is the traditional, one of the traditional models here. It's a wooden block, white oak block. It has a wedge-shaped, it's a wedge-shaped blade, laminated piece of hard steel. You can see all the shiny part in the front, right? You flip it over on the bevel, you see the line of the lamination. That lamination line is called the homon. Same name that they use when they look at the lamination line in a samurai sword. How about that? Does that help? Right? So you got the hard steel, you got the homon, you got the soft steel. Here you can see a lot of little peck marks. That's called uridashi. That comes from this steel. When you've sharpened this side, right, you got land, you got a flat edge right here. Those two edges are what creates that edge. Once you sharpen back into the hollow grind, you don't have that edge there. You can't grind this down because then it won't fit back in the block. So what you got to do is tap on the soft steel and stretch it, and that bends the hard steel over. So when you reflatten this, you get the land back. So you've got an edge. That's something that's frightening to do, to hit a piece of steel with a hammer. It's a blacksmithing thing, but it's something you have to learn. You have to be very sensitive to the hit and the sound of this, because like I said, each blade maker has different hardness and soft. He might have a really hard piece and a soft piece. He might have two pieces that are the same, hard and soft. They're different metal, but again, you got to learn, you got to make friends with your tools, right? These tools are made with such spirit. They don't take heavy-handedness well. They don't need that, right? These things are made, they're made with perfection. And as your sharpening gets more perfect, which I don't know what the end game is of perfect is, but when you get your blade all set and right and you got everything working, it's still partly mystery and partly joy. So again, you got a tapered blade that fits into a tapered slot, and that's where the adjustment for the blade is. There's no screws or anything. So traditionally, they had one blade and one block. The die, the wooden part's called the die. Right? They only had one blade. They added the secondary blade when they ran into Dutch shipbuilders who used the secondary blade in the Western plains. In the Western plain, the chipper, the frog, holds the blade in. The Japanese plane does not need this. I don't use it in most of my planes. I use it in this one because it's a rough plane. I'm taking off thicker shavings. As I get into more finer shavings, then I don't use that because I'm on a much different, I got a different idea going on. So this, you can see, is a roughing plane, a smoothing plane where you'd start with wood that had a hard texture on it. I can take off a little bigger shavings. Right? And then when I get it down truly smooth, then I go to a burnishing plane to finish it. So I'm going to plane it with this, get everything flat and smooth. Size is set. I'm going to do all my layout, do my cutting, fabricate my pieces, do a dry fit, before I plane, then I'm going to take it apart and plane it and finish it and plane all the layout lines and the fingerprints and probably a little blood on there somewhere. Clean that all off with a finishing plane. Finishing plane to burnishing plane. Again, the difference is you still got the same sharp blade, but the real difference is that how far the cutting edge is from that gliding surface compared to this one, which is almost on top of it. Right? So this one, you can only take a very thin shaving because the shaving won't get. But what that does is that it's at the pull plane. And as the pressure, the friction of the gliding surface pushes on the wood, it heats the wood up and burnishes because it brings the oil out of the wood. That's the traditional surface, right? Because when this is so close, you're cutting, but you're pushing down on top of it. So all that heat goes into the wood. When it's way back here, the heat in the shaving goes out and you don't get the burnish. You get a flat surface, but you don't get this burnish when it's really close. All right. So that's one way you can tell. You go to Japan, you see probably 3 different kinds of temples in general. One would be the oldest kind, which would be replicas of Indian temples. You tell that by the really complicated, simplified bracket systems that go out, like Todaji is that all. In the old days, those things were all painted and, must have been really incredible. Now they look old like they are still there, right? So, that was the first phase. Then the second phase came in with the Chinese style, which was a little more sophisticated with the brackets, but it was painted. Japanese temples, the Wayo, don't paint their buildings, right? What made the difference was this plane. You plane this wood, the surface is burnished. There's no water I can say no water, very little water penetration into the flat grain of the wood. All the water goes in the end, right? So ends are always covered. That's why you see them painted. Usually on temples, they're all painted white. But again, when you burnish this, because once you paint it, water is going to get under there, then the wood's going to rot. If you leave it open and it breathes, and it's out of the rain and the sun, and it's open and it can breathe and dry out, it'll really last a long time. That's what a lot of these buildings are. Again, the joinery that's putting them together lets them be able to take apart and be fixed. I mean, things rot away after 100, 200, 300 years. Lightning strikes, they can take it apart and fix it and put it back together. I mean, I was in Japan last March, and they had a thing they're talking about Osaka Castle. They had taken the top 2 floors off and leveled it up because the floor was off a couple centimeters over a big distance. It seemed totally ridiculous to me, but bless their heart. It was a pretty big job, but they straightened that thing all out, took it apart, put it back together. I mean, it's built to do that. So to me, that's one of the fundamental things that makes joinery worth it. I mean, it's fun to do. It's really intriguing and engrossing how to figure out the geometry and have the skills to be able to make all this stuff fit together and be able to move. So again, I think the joinery, the joinery in Asia at least back to China. China built incredible amounts of temples, and I'm sure most of them got burned up or something. But their joinery was designed in a way that everything fit together and was held together by gravity and the weight of the roof on the building, right? But the joints were made in such a way is that they were flexible, more like Tai Chi, not a rough, solid building like you'd see in England with knee braces made out of oak on a piece of granite, right? That's kind of the European model stereotype. You look at an Asian temple like that, the joints are kind of loose, they all hold together, but it sways with an earthquake, right? So the things developed in earthquake country are going to have a different connection to them than something that's not having to do that. Probably in Europe, all you'd have to worry about is wind shear or snow loads or something like that. They don't have a lot of earthquakes, but you get a building that starts shaking and moving. It's pretty amazing. One of the good things I would recommend you checking out on YouTube is a Nova PBS special on mysteries of the Forbidden City in China. They've got a video on that where my friend Richard Wyborg was there with them, and they did a shake test on an earthquake platform with a 10 scale temple they built, complete with the roof and the whole thing. And they shook it on this earthquake table to a 10.1 earthquake, and the thing didn't fall apart or tip over. I mean, you can see this thing move. I mean, a 10, I don't even know what that is. I've been through some 6s and 7s in the Bay Area, but a 10, I can't imagine. And this thing shook, and it kept raising the shake, and the shake would roll over. And the way the joinery was, and some of the cantilevers that were built inside the building would turn the building back to the other side after it got to a point. So, I mean, the building was really walking like this. It's just on rocks. It wasn't hooked. They're not hooked down to anything. It's on the, so as it moved after this thing shook like that, I think the thing moved maybe an inch off of where it was in the first place. Building was still there. A lot of the clay walls had fallen out, but that's easy to fix. So, you know, they really put this thing through the test to show, you know, and it was engineers, they got all kinds of motion meters and all this stuff. So they had all this mic'd out, you know, and it was just really astounding to see this building shake so hard and see that. So the Japanese took those ideas, but they were much more exact in their fittings. But again, even with the compression fit and the joints they make, there's still that ability for the joint to absorb the motion and not split apart. You know, to me, what makes that all work and makes that joinery different than everybody else's in the world is their attention to detail to putting the compression of the mortise and tenon on the end grain of the mortise. What am I talking about here? Well, let's talk about joinery for a minute. This is something I was doing for my class I got going on with Kids Rukai. We're doing meetings like this with projects involved. So what I've got here is that, you know, we're looking at compression fit joinery. You probably can't read this. That means where the bonding surface, where the structures are against the end grain of a mortise. So if you had a hole here, I know I got one somewhere. What I'm saying is the pressure would be oriented this way against that mortise. So if you had a hole, a mortise that looked like this, say that was a hole, right? So when the tenon went in there, you'd want the pressure going this way. You can get tremendous pressure, compression against the end grain. If you've got compression going this way, the board's going to split in half, right? So it's very carefully calculated on all these joints. That's the compression fit, right? So again, if you're looking at this, right, if this is the mortise, the hole, and you stick the tenon in there, the pressure you want is against these two surfaces. You want it snug here, but if it's tight this way, you're splitting the grain line, and there's any pressure, then it's going to split the wood. If you've got a lot of pressure on the end grain, it won't split the wood. Now, that's not putting something too big into a hole that's too little. It's a very it's a very calculated fit, and that depends on you knowing what the compression of the wood you're using is. If you go from oak to Port Orford or something else, those compression lines are totally different because the woods have they're either brittle or too soft. The Port Orford and a lot of woods that are really good for the joinery have a very even density line here. Some Doug fir, you have very hard growth lines and then a soft spot. The hard growth line and a soft spot. This is very consistent. You want it more consistent even if it's softer, because if your bonding surface is in one of those squishy summer growths, you don't have any compression, right? That's why they take so much time drying and curing their wood. So when they get it, that's what it is. It's not going to be 10% smaller in 10 years. It's going to be pretty much that size. It does do some wearing away. So what the joinery process is here, we're looking at well, in my teaching, I think I've been teaching this since I started working at Japan Woodworker when they opened back in the early 80s. I did their front entryway there when they first opened. And I started working there as a salesman just to learn how to say some of these funny names and get the 10% discount on the tool. That's what it was really about. So being there, working on Saturdays, and people come in, ask questions. None of the other counter people really knew anything because they weren't, I was doing this. So we'll ask Jay. Well, that's where I started to set up classes because I got tired of saying the same thing over and over again. So let's just run some classes and deal with all this stuff. So it started off over there, you know, back in the early 80s, in the back room over there, doing stuff, having great fun. I did classes at HEDA for probably 15 years, teaching people, you know, and mostly because I was actually using the tools, and what I knew was a little more than what I'd read in the book. That's where you kind of get caught, because what you read, they can't always tell you everything. And when you know from your own experience, then you can fill in the gaps a lot better than with what you're trying, you know, what you've read and tried to memorize. So, so what we're going to look at here. So what I'm saying is joinery, to me, is reductive processes. You have a piece of wood, you want to reduce it into a shape that's going to fit into another piece of wood that's been reduced into another shape. How we do that? We're using a chisel, and we're using a Ryoba. Now, like I said, chisels were pretty much early on. That seems like a pretty logical step to be able to cut wood and do stuff. The Ryoba, this is a Ryoba. Nokogiri is the name of saws. Ryoba is a saw that has rip teeth and crosscut teeth on the same saw. So you're getting two saws in one. You need both those to do joinery. Crosscut means you're sawing across the grain, right? Rip cut means you're sawing with the grain. That's the two surfaces. You don't see a lot of Western carpenters with a rip saw because they're not doing joinery. If you were doing joinery, you'd have to have a rip saw, right? So you can see these teeth are both designed totally different. The first crosscut saws, the first saws they made were rip saws. Kind of like this. It's called my beaky. It's a big rip saw. This is how they would take a log and saw boards out of it, right? It took a real man to do this, right? So this is an old one. You can see, I don't know, you probably can't see, but there's 5 different pieces of steel in here that have been welded together because you want real good stuff here. Up here is just like the fin that keeps it in line. So that's not really very good steel. But again, this long face keeps it lined up in the board when you're sawing the board. I read a story about the last sawyer in Tokyo. Japanese like hand sawn lumber. They don't like rotor wheel skill saw cuts because it heats the wood up and burns the wood and takes a lot of the vitality out of the wood. They like band saws because it keeps the wood cool, doesn't heat it up, right? So anyway, they asked him, you know, you've been doing this for 50 or 60 years. So they asked him how he got so good. He said, well, you saw a board out, and if it's more than an 1/8 of an inch difference in one end and the other, you don't get paid for the board. Because the person getting the board is going to have to hand plane it to make it flat, and they don't want to do that. So he had to saw a board out of a log within an 1/8 of an inch all the way around. And I mean, you know, we've set this up and sawed some logs, and it's man's work. But I mean, again, to think about how this was made and being able to make something this big and flat and keep it flat, that's harder to do than sharpening teeth. So I'm sure you can't really see close up on what all these teeth look like, but the guy that makes the saw does the hot work. He may not be the guy who sharpens it. That's the sharpener, the metate. Metate is sharpening the saw. So again, it's a matter of straightening them and tensioning them. There's a lot of work done in that because as your saws are cutting, these saws cut on the pull stroke as opposed to the Western saw, which is a push saw. So this, you're tensioning the blade as you're sawing with it. When you're sawing with a Western saw, you're compressing the blade, pushing down, all right? So going to a pull saw lets you have a much harder blade, a much thinner blade, because it doesn't need the compression. Plus it's harder, the teeth are much sharper. And so you can see this is a hard blade because I've chipped off the end on this a couple of times. I don't know, it happens. It means it's a good saw, right? So the delicacy of these saws demand that you take care of them and you know how to use them and not abuse them, because you run through a nail or something and the saw is messed up. You know, it takes a special person to know how to fix that. This is a professional quality saw, an old Shindo that I like really a lot. Take the blade out, you send it back to where you got it, and they'll send it to Japan and sharpen. There used to be a guy in this country that sharpened my saws for me, and it was really a fantastic experience watching that. I also got to work with a guy that was his grandfather had been the sawmaker for the emperor, and when we met him, he was an older man. We brought him over here a couple of times. We built the 13th century forge at the Arquez Boat School over in Sausalito in early 2000s. He came over for a couple of weeks, and we did workshops, made hammers, and did forging, and it was really a fantastic experience to watch this guy work. Because again, he was old school. He didn't go to metallurgy school. He could tell the temperature of a fire by the color of it. It was just really astounding how tuned in and focused and experienced this guy was. I mean, he was a real wizard. I felt very lucky to have been able to spend time with him and get to know him. Again, didn't speak English, it didn't matter. You meet people like that, you're soaking in things that are nonverbal. I don't even know what he told me, but he changed my whole outlook on a lot of things. You know, so if you meet people like that, you really need to, understand and appreciate what they're giving to you, because a lot of these old guys are going away, and somebody doesn't take it up, it's gone. You won't refigure how to do all this now. So again, this is a really nice saw. You tell by how much it sounds, how hard it is, how good it is. Today, the other thing that they probably made an improvement on. Two things I think I would say right off. One is that they've developed a lot of man-made sharpening stones. In the old days, everything was some kind of a natural stone that they found. There are mines in Japan that they've been digging these stones out. It's like a gold mine. They follow these veins of different limestone deposits, and each one is a different polishing or cutting ability because of the kind of seashells that were packed into this geologic thing that started in Hawaii and has moved all the way to Japan and got bent up into the mountains. So they find these veins and follow them into the mountains. Some of them are like, 2 miles deep. There's no way I'm being in a mine in Japan. That just doesn't sound like fun. Anyway, they've made a lot of new modern sharpening stones that are a little more predictable. I myself like the old ones just because whatever. The other thing that they've come up with, which is a real advantage, is these replaceable blade saws. It has the metal blade with both teeth. It has a nut here that you can take out and get a new blade. Most of them, other brands, let's see. Well, like this one. This brand I used for a long time, really good saw. It's a Gyokicho brand. It's got that little kind of swan-looking stemble on it. Nice saws, work pretty good. I got this one from somebody else, and it was a much better saw. The guy had used a piece of steel in here that can be resharpened. He's got more handwork and it's tensioned better, and the teeth are sharpened better. They last longer. The problem with this saw is they use a funky piece of steel that doesn't hold an edge. This is all machine made. I think the only handwork done is putting it in a plastic bag. It's got a thin thin piece of sheet metal. They cut the teeth in it, and then if you notice, the edge of all these teeth are blue because they've electro hardened it to make it hold up an edge to cut wood for a while. Problem is, once it dulls down, you can't resharpen it because the files cost more than a bunch of saw blades. So you end up just throwing it away. It's unusable unless you're going to make cabinet scrapers or something out of it, right? So to me, this was a great advantage. It wasn't as good as my handmade saw. Then I found this one. It has a much better feel to it. It's got a tighter locking thing here. The set in the teeth and the tensioning is better. Sometimes you can even see little hammer marks where he's gone back to retension this after the grinding and the shaping of the blade is gone, right? So all those kind of things you see show more handwork, which is going to be a much more better quality saw. But again, the big thing was that this saw can be resharpened. I've seen pictures of real saws, professional saws that were down to, you know, maybe 1.5 inches wide here because they've been sharpened so many times. Right? But you need people to do that. At this point, you know, it's easy for a machine to resharpen all these, but a machine can't deal with all the warps and the twists in it that you have to do, that a metate yaw has to know how to do to straighten it out and take the kinks out of it, right? Because again, as you're pulling it, sometimes the steel, like on that one, will stretch and get bigger and littler, and it'll bind on you a little. Right? This guy won't do that because he's tensioned it much better. So this and some man-made stones, you know, this saw, I don't know, it's 45 bucks. I don't know what the yen is now, but there's not a better saw in the world for $45 than this one, right? I use it a lot. I got better saws for other things, but you know, for general use, this is the one I get my students to start with. The other saw, I mean, there's lots of different kinds of saws. This one is called a dozuki. It's a very thin cross cut. There's also a rip cut, but it's a very thin blade that's on a back saw. Right? Again, it's a pull saw. This guy, okay, we could do a kerf with this. So the kerf is how wide. So you see, that's a very nice, clean, accurate cut. All right. See what that looks like? Nice, easy cut. Saw is usually want to be bigger, twice as big as what you're sawing on, so you clean the shavings out of the kerf. The kerf is the groove that it cuts, right? And if you don't take the kerf, if you don't clean the kerf out, the saw won't cut once these gullets are full. So you got to get it out so the fluff falls out so you can saw deeper. That's this one. Now this is the dozuki. This is for really fine. Now, look at that one.
Oh.
Right. Now I was talking about when you get into fine work and especially interior work, shoji, cabinetry, that kind of stuff, that kind of accuracy is right there. You know, it's not a, you know, you go right at it. This little saw is, you know, something really special. You know, it's really a pleasure to use. It's hard to use because again, your body has got to be in line with the stroke that you're going. It took me a while to saw with these saws because my stroke wasn't in line, right? So every time you pull and you're not in line, you're moving the kerf around. So it took me a while. I've got the first real good saw I bought, I couldn't use it. It took me, I was so frustrated. I knew there wasn't anything wrong with the saw, it was me. And it took me a long time to get myself where I could pull that in a straight line, that I wasn't torquing the blade one way or the other, right? And again, that comes from growing up so heavy-handed, right? You get a light touch. You know, the interesting thing in the last, I don't know, couple of years, my classes at Laney have been about half women. It's not a strength contest. Endurance maybe, but not a strength thing. So, I mean, women are usually much more light-handed and do better than the men, and it just drives the men crazy because they come in all maxed out and want to push through all this, It doesn't work that way. Once you start sawing it and putting pressure on the saw twists and warp inside the grain, and the grain will make it wander, right? Might saw in the wrong place. You might have to go back and pair it up. But again, it's not really an efficient technique. So again, the time you invest preparing your tools and preparing yourself is more than you do when you go in and pick up and push a button on a table saw. But the results and what you got for your long life of working is such an advantage that, I can't imagine myself doing it any other way. It's really, I get working I don't come to my shop and pretend I'm Japanese for 8 hours a day. I come out here to get work done, have a good time, enjoy what I'm doing. If I've got an apprentice or somebody helping me, we don't talk very much. We're both absorbed in what we're doing. I've been around some Japanese crews. You go on an American crew, there's loud rock and roll music going on and crazy dancing and all that. Japanese crews I've seen, nobody's talking, everybody's working. They might take a smoke break every hour or so, and that's when they talk to each other. But when they're working, they're focusing and concentrating. You can't really talk and blabber about this and do it. It's hard. I do it a lot, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. But again, you got to know how to fix your mistakes. That's, you're not going to be perfect all the time. So that takes us through the tools, through the saws. Again, I talked about the planes and the burnishing. That's the finishing tools. So if you got any questions at this point, let Peter know, and we'll see if we can expand the conversation a little bit.
Yeah, we do, Jay.
All right.
No, they didn't come in. Well, we have one gentleman who joined us a little late, but and he asked if the art of hand joinery was a fading art in Japan, or whether it was still respected, or maybe by whom, and whether there's a revival at all going on. And you might take this as an opportunity to talk about people, expats coming to Japan in this skills of life, such as yourself.
Well, like I said, all these old temples and shrines. I mean, you got Buddhist temples, you got Shinto shrines, you got all kinds of pavilions and things. They have to be done, like I said, in a traditional way with traditional tools that were appropriate at that time. So that's kept a pretty good volume of carpenters available to do this work. I'm sure it's not what it was in the old days. I think a lot of the big companies that go into residential building, that was all usually hand done. They've got these incredible machines, computer controlled router shaper things that just do, some amazing things. They don't do what a Japanese carpenter could do with his chisels, but they make some really passable joinery. Obviously, it's on more of an industrial scale. I'm sure there's crews that are still doing traditional stuff that have plugged in a battery drill here, or a hog out a mortise with a drill bit and then clean it up, which isn't a traditional way. But I mean, again, a lot of these things depend on the quality of the work, and what the reputation that the maker would have. I mean, there's some very famous people that, just build tea houses, or, they got the big company that has, rebuilds temples and does all that stuff. So, there's a lot of, a lot of the crafts and cabinetry and tansu and those kind of things, I think it's probably gone a lot more towards machines, but still there's a lot of things that need to be done by hand, and can only be done by hand because of rules and regulation, or because, I met I was at a blacksmith shop back last March. Guy's been making plane blades for me in my classes since the 80s. I must have sold a truckload of his planes that are, just so sweet and perfect. He was an older guy. He had a son who went off to Tokyo to do whatever he was going to do. He ended up coming back home and taking over Dad's business. He never saw such a proud father. you know, it was really something to see, to, you know, watch the old man, watch the boy do it. You know, I mean, it's just like, I'm sure he was seeing himself taking over from his father, because it'd been, you know, one of those long-term family things. And, you know, it's really tremendous to be able to see that there are young people coming into, you know, they'll probably, you know, they'll be having to go for the, you know, more higher quality things, because middle stuff and lower stuff isn't worth making. So it has to do, I mean, there's economics, and, you know, one of the things that they were, you know, complaining about was, you know, resources are running out. A lot of the special metals and things that the modern stuff they're using, Chinese kind of have a stranglehold on a lot of those minerals and materials that they need to make certain kinds of steel. I know the guy, Mr. Yamamoto, showed me his backyard outside his house that had this big pile of old chains in the thing. So that'd probably be enough of the soft steel from these old chains that were the old smell. So before 1839, iron was smelted with charcoal. After that, they turned to electric furnaces, which changed the whole compound. So when you see old iron, it's got like wood grain in it, right? It's puddled. It's made that way. It's not extruded like steel would be. So he had a whole stack of this, and they save old bridges that are got that steel in it, because that's what the thing they figure is the most perfect thing for the soft steel to carry the fraction and the pressure that comes off the cutting for the hard steel. So, you know, because there's so many easier ways now to do it, and computers and, you know, that kind of stuff that are running the industrial part. You know, who knows, in a few years, there may not be any people there. There'll be architects or draftsmen doing it from upstairs on the computer. All you need is a mechanic to set the machine up. But I don't think that's ever going to disappear, because it is so usable, and it's, again, something that's necessary to maintain these traditional buildings. I think it's making a big big comeback in America. I think people are, you know, like kind of the people back to earth and all that, they're rediscovering their colonial roots and log cabins and back to the earth kind of stuff, which again isn't Japanese, but it's the same kind of attitude towards what materials that we got to build a house out of. We need to bring in a bunch of sheetrock, or can we use mud and plaster, you know, bamboo lath and plaster or something, you know? So there's a lot of technology that's, I think, going to be hybridized into these kind of structures. But I think, you know, for this kind of structure, you know, it's very stable, long-lived structure that's repairable and fixable and beautiful. You know, so I hope it doesn't. I don't see that it could. It's such a part of their culture.
Let's see. Another participant wondered if you figured out what the brand of the $45 saw you love so well is, because everyone kind of wants to go out and buy it.
Yeah. This saw is made by Ikeda. I get it from Suzuki-ya.
Oh, yeah.
They've got a website, I'm sure, suzuki-ya.com. They're in Berkeley. They only have a website. They don't have a storefront. Suzuki is an old friend of mine. She's been around a long time. She goes to Japan. She looked these guys up. She went to Japan looking for makers that were small guys who didn't have a lot of profile or any big distributors. She found a lot of people, you know, these guys live out in the country. You know, they're not usually city folks. But she went out and visited a lot of these folks. And some of them, she said, didn't want to deal with it because she was a woman. So right away, we checked them off the list. But she knows what she's got, what she's doing. She knows people that can have any kind of specialty item made. She found this guy, and this is really something special. This saw costs about as much as a Gyokucho, and again, for $45, you can't get a better saw. You can spend more money and get a better saw, but you won't be spending $45. So, you know, I'd say check her out. I use her tools a lot. I trust her. She's upright. She knows what she's talking about. She's passionate about it. She's one of the founding members of the Kizurukai along with me. And, you know, she's really a very knowledgeable person.
Yeah, I'd like to second that. When she used to work at a competitor's retail store.
Howard Heater, yeah.
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 I've always found she knew everything, including how to
Yeah.
fix it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Everything.
Yeah, yeah. She, yeah. So, I mean, again, we're really lucky that we've got such knowledgeable people who, you know, put up with us trying to struggle through finding out what we need and how to get there. So, you know, again, you only need a few good tools. Uh, my theory is, if you've got more tools you can keep sharp, you got too many tools. I'm the first one guilty of that. I got an addiction and a craving for fine tools. I don't have a lot that I have that I've collected. Everything I've bought, I've put to use. I didn't have a lot of dispendable cash to invest in things that I wasn't going to use. So I've spent money, good money on good tools, and I'm really glad I did. What I bought back then now is twice as much. See, and all that comes about because of currency manipulation and people hoarding steel in the market and rising prices and the yen changing. I know when I was in Japan in 1985 with my wife and I, we were there for a month. The yen was 260 to a dollar. Now it's probably what, 100 or 108 or something. I mean, it's down. And at one time it was down to like 89. So if you bought tools at 150 and the yen goes to 89, that's half of your, you know, you can't do business that way. So I know that was really hard on some of the tool brokers that were struggling through the different economic things that have happened over the last years. You know, now it seems to be stable that, you know, what they try to manipulate that so the balance of trade and the cars and the stereos and all the stuff carries over into the corn and the pork we sell them or something. I don't know. Can't figure that out.
Well, let's see. I think you have a colleague, a fellow carpenter, because I don't even understand this question. This fellow John asks if you could talk about or even demonstrate how to true a rough board, like, you know, for a panel. You know, you're going to have to explain to the rest of us what a rough board is.
A rough board would be, I would think what he's talking about is something that's got a real rough surface and was like resawn when it was wet, which is what most lumber you get from the lumber yard. You can either get it rough and wet, which is a full size, or you get it kiln dried and it's been surface four sides and they take about a half an inch off of the dimensions of the board. Usually when I start off, you're looking at, you know, something like this. You want to look and see that it's solid and true. Here's a pretty rough edge here. You know, what I'm trying to do is see, and I want to, you know, maybe lay it on something flat and make sure that it's flat and true and not warped. You check out the warp or the wind in a board with winding sticks. Right. These are two pieces exactly the same. So what we're doing is setting it on the opposite end of the board and checking the wind in the board. Right. So if they both line up flat, then that is flat. So you check one end here and here, and then you'd work in and find out where the high spots are and plane them off. Do the same thing on the bottom of the plane. This is a gliding surface. They got to be flat and parallel. If they're not flat and parallel, you got nothing for the blade to line up. So what you're going to do is put one of them there and one of them out here and sight them up till they're level. And then I'm going to take this little scraper and scrape it off till they line up flat. That's truing up the bottom. Then you got some concave things. But for a board, you know, you can set it down. If it's flat, that's pretty good. You just, you know, like I said, I took off. First, I planed this with a wider plane, a thicker, wider throat opening to get it down something smooth. And then when I really wanted to get it nice and flat and smooth, mirror-like, then I would use a finer blade, set much finer, because I've taken off all the rough resawn stuff. You can't do that with this kind of plane. You got to do it with a wider throat. And then when I get it down to where it's starting to get right, I'm looking at getting that surface and bringing up that surface and making it flat. So if I can pull a shaving that thin over the length of this board, that whole board is within that thickness of shaving. Part of what the Kizurukai phenomenon was based on was in Japan, they started having, it started off as a grassroots thing of shops opening up to get kids interested in things they'd never see before, right? Then it got into being a national event and all that. And the thing that got it going was the planing contests that they do, what we do too. They usually using a 70 millimeter plane. The test is to see who can make the widest, thinnest, and longest shaving with a plane like that, right? So
Reminds me of a tractor pull, Jay.
yeah, but a lot more subtle, a lot more. So anyway, what they, so it's, we do that too. That's part of the thing. So it's not, it's not really a contest, but it really challenges you to do the best you can standing in front of a bunch of people, which is totally different than being in your shop by yourself, being romantic, right? So, the pressure is there and it's good for you because it really makes you focus, right? So the thinnest shaving I've heard of was 2 microns. Micron, not thousandths, microns. 0 microns is nothing. This is 2 of those nothings, right? It's like spider webs, thinner than silk. It's unbelievable. When you get that thin, only certain pieces of wood will be able to do that. The boards they sell that they use in the Kizurukai for the planing contest might cost $700. I don't have any, but I've seen them. But it's all really tight fight. So you couldn't do that with a piece of oak because there's not grain structure that fine. If you do you find out a lot about wood when you plane it because you see thin shavings with what grain structure is left. This isn't really a really crazy one, but it's thinner than paper and it's still solid. If that was a piece of oak, there'd be nothing there hardly. All right. So this is again what I'll be getting down. I usually take all that off with my thickness planer, so I don't have to do all that. If I've got an apprentice here, I put him on it, and that's where he learns how to do that stuff. Then he can do the machine. So you really, it's a hard process. And again, I think to me that's the only place I use machines. Everything else is done by hand. I don't sand anything. I do have a router for cutting Formica once in a while, which I haven't done that in 30 years, but to me, I love my tools. I like sharpening. I like being around. I love smelling this wood. I like feeling that sexy slide right there. I love, the whole thing to me is gorgeous. And then when you put all that into each thing you're doing, when you get to the end, it's really, it's a wonderful thing most of the time. Sometimes not so much, but again, that's where a good carpenter knows how to fix his mistakes. So, other questions?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Hiromi asks, how long did it take for Jay to get used to Japanese tools? She goes on to share, for me, I learned with Japanese nokogiri, so it was very hard to get used to Western saws, as the Japanese ones cut on the pole and the Western on the push.
I grew up in Kentucky, a little rural area. I went to the smallest high school in the state of Kentucky. I grew up, like I said, on a farm. My family been blacksmiths since after the Revolutionary War. I grew up, my dad was something special. He was really, he really understood mechanical, how things fixed, how things were worked, how things were put together. He could fix them better than they came out of the factory. So I grew up around hand tools. And my grandfather, like I said, my first woodworking experience I remember is seeing my grandfather working on a wooden wagon wheel. And he had a table where he had all the pieces and all the spokes he would shave with a spoke shave that fit into a mortise in all the pieces that were the outside of the wheel, right? I remember watching him doing that. And then they took a piece of round metal, the size of the circumference of the wheel. They built a round fire out in front of the shop on the ground, heated the metal up till it was red hot, drove it down on there because it was really tight. And as it shrunk, it pulled all the joinery together into the hub of the wheel. So, I didn't intellectually understand that as a 6-year-old, but, that kind of process and tools and how things went to. So when I saw Japanese tools, it seemed very, it didn't seem so foreign. I'm a sculptor with good hand skills doing woodworking. I'm a California daiku. I'm not a Japanese daiku, right? But anyway, my sensibility and my training, and my aesthetics fit right into the precision and the tinkering with the tools and all those kind of things that are more involved. Like I said, these tools are made with a spirit that don't like heavy-handedness. So realizing my saw wasn't working right, I didn't have anybody to ask or Google. I mean, that was way before that stuff. So again, it was just doing it till one time you do it and it feel right, and you think, what did I do different? I don't know. Then I do it. Oh, there's the stroke. So the whole thing to me was like breaking all this down into a rhythm that was kind of copacetic with whatever the tool was. You're chiseling. It's a rhythm hitting. It's not, you're not doing it out of anger, right? You pick up a nice rhythm. You see how the wood's cutting. You know how you need to sharpen the chisel a little different or whatever, but you get more things show up at one time than just being focused on, I'm just doing this or just doing that. Because part of this to me developed a bigger awareness of being attention, listening, smelling. I mean, sometimes I'm sharpening, I smell the steel coming off. You're sawing Port Orford. It's one of the most perfumey woods that there are. When you go to Japan to a new temple, it'll smell like that for 6 months. I built shoji out at Port Orford, and it'll make the room smell like that for, months. And then you get fresh tatami that smell like fresh mowed hay. I'm a pig in heaven right there, boy. That's close to home for me. So, all this back to nature stuff wasn't intellectual. I mean, I grew up around hillbilly architecture. They'd used some old logs and set them on a bunch of dry stacked rocks. Well, I'd seen that before, but not to perfection and the elegance and the grace that was put into, what I saw, first from Makoto Imai and then a couple other people that left it all, left it right there. And there was nothing, you get it done, think, well, that's it. I can't do it any better until next time. So, everybody struggles with different things. I have students that, are good for layout, but don't do this, or they're good, a lot of different things. But again, when you find all these simple activities and you spend your time working on them and understanding, you're working on yourself. That chisel is just like a mirror that reflects back at you, and I think that again is part of something that bleeds into a little Zen that comes from Japan, of clearing your mind and paying attention, focusing, and not carrying a lot of baggage into what you're trying to do, because that's what you got to get rid of so you can pay attention to how things feel. If you're thinking about something else when you're sharpening, you're not connected right. So again, it's like being able, that sharpening is like a meditation for me. I come in, first thing I want to do is sharpen my tools. I need sharper tools for the day, but I need to settle down and get into that rhythm. That's kind of a human rhythm that carries over a heartbeat into working with the wood, because you try to force too much and get this industrial production mentality going on, and that's not where we're talking. That's not where this is coming from. So, again, different situations. If this is something you're doing for fun, take it serious. It's serious fun. There's so much here that you just need to spend time with. It's great stuff.
That's an excellent segue to our next question from Roger in Fresno. I'm going to preface his question by recalling that you talked about a rhythm of hitting the chisel that's appropriate to the nature of the wood being worked, and about not just trying to punch through it like, like you were on some kind of boxing contest, knocking the other guy out. And you talked about industrial processes versus this more kind of like human touch. And so here's, I know you got a story to tell here. Roger asked, can you recommend a source of Port Orford cedar? Well, industrial production and just punching that logging outfit through there has had a big impact on that, hasn't it?
Port Orford in this country, it's like a subspecies of hinoki. It's a kami cypress. There's big, beautiful forests in Japan. Japan has, I don't know, many more cedars and cypresses that grow in that climate than we do. I mean, some of their, their sugi is kind of like a red cedar, but it's more dense and oilier and, those kind of things. But Port Orford in this country, it was used for arrow shafts, because it's one of those woods that when it gets real thin, it's very stable. It's very fine grain in it that a piece of Doug fir wouldn't work because the grain didn't right. They used it for arrow shafts. They used it in the old days for Venetian blind flaps. Because again, you get those thin things that stayed flat. Most wood, you get it that thin, it sets in the sun, it's going to go crazy. Also, first I ever heard of it, it was called bleacher seat wood. Because when you got a bleacher seat, these flat grains don't raise up and put splinters in your butt, right? I've gotten lumber that was when they took down the stadium seats up at Cal. All those seats were Port Orford, like 6 inches by 3-inch pieces that were, had some holes in them. Work around the holes. I mean, I've had more luck with used lumber most of the time than a lot of the new stuff. Contemporary Port Orford. I get stuff, I only know one place to carry the, I don't know what they call it, C grade, decking grade, that I use for my classes and for some stuff. The best Port Orford I get from a mill up in Oregon. See that it grew in Japan, it grew in Taiwan, and it grew in Southern Oregon. So when the Japanese found our Port Orford, they came in and we sold it to them in logs. They didn't even get enough money out of it to pay for all the roads that the government put into the forest to take the logs out. They weren't smart enough because the Japanese said they want certain sizes. They don't want a 2x6. They want some measurement that's in shaku, or they use centimeters now, right? So most of the mills didn't want to change their calibrations. So they just sold them the logs for nothing, right? They got logs floating in the harbors over there, for 100 years. Meanwhile, we cut down all our good stuff that was there. And then when they went into the forest with these big machines and dragged the stuff out, they spread a root fungus through the forest that's killing most of the trees that are left. So I don't know, to tell you the truth. I got some lumber from a mill up there 5 or 6 years ago, but yeah, it's hard to find. I'm not sure. Let me think what that mill's name was. I don't know, Medford Mill. It's up in Oregon somewhere. He shipped it down. I mean, you'd have to buy a pretty good load to get it from the mill.
Yeah, Medford's in the upper Willamette Valley.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's in Medford or that's just the guy's name. Oh. This stuff I got from a place down in Watsonville called Jackal Enterprises. They do a lot of sustainable harvest, urban harvest. I know they got a lot of big timbers out of one of the wharfs over in San Francisco, and they took it apart, huge, big old Doug fir stuff. Yeah, first house I built, I used recycled big timbers like that, and it was just stable and done. It might have a drill hole in it, but it's not going to shrink and crack. It's already done all that, right? You want to know what that's going to do beforehand. But yeah, finding Port Orford, I know we've been trying to find something else, but I don't, pine's not the same. Most of the time for my projects and stuff I use for my class, we use a poplar. Poplar's readily available. It's not really that expensive. Again, it has a very good end grain density, which means it doesn't have a lot of hard and soft contrast in it. That works really good for the joinery because you cut and you get nice, clean, flat, solid surfaces. So I'm not really into tropical forests, cutting them down. I mean, that seems like a disaster. I use a lot of Western red cedar. I probably use more of that in my career than anything else. And unfortunately, that all came out of the Tongass National Forest up in British Columbia, which is the last temperate forest of domestic woods left in America. And they're shutting that down because it's almost gone. So, I mean, you know, my philosophy was I use the best wood I can and do the best job with it and give it the longest life I can. Something like that I'd never use for decking or crap stuff. Last deck I put on my house, I used recycled plastic milk cartons. Couldn't believe I'd do that, but I just couldn't put down wood decking there is such a waste. I mean, I've done that before, but you know, I think we got to move on and look at our resources. We can't just keep cutting. We did that when we thought it was endless. Now there's like 2% of old growth redwood forest left in California. You ever been out in the big trees, the redwoods? If that's not a spiritual place, I've never been anywhere more spiritual than that. I mean, you just feel those trees and the energy and the, you know, the relationship to the environment. They are their whole environment. I mean, it's really an amazing thing. And I think what I try to help people, my students understand is, you know, this was a living tree. This one maybe only made it 40 or 50 or 60 years. Some of the red cedar we used on the, redid all the stands at the bonsai garden at Lake Merritt. Some of those trees that we looked at, wood was 6 or 8 feet in diameter and 1,500 years old. I mean, you got a different respect for what you're working on when you realize what you're working on. It's like, you know, this isn't throwaway stuff. You know, you realize this thing put up with a lot of stuff over 1,500 years. And you can tell what it put up with by looking at the growth rings in the end. You buy a piece of wood, look at it. See where it came from. See how big the growth is. Oh, some of them are real tight and then they'll get real wide. Well, more rain, less rain. Like I said, that's like dendrochronology. They can look at wood from Viking ships and know that it was oak that came from Denmark in 1320. It's really an amazing thing. I mean, there's a whole environmental record contained in the wood. And each piece is different. So again, you got to keep on your toes when you're dealing with that, because it's not a blind activity. You got to pay attention.
Well, that's great, Jay. You also answered the next question, which was from a fellow carpenter who had studied something called kamakurabori, which is carving. He went over to Yokohama to do that for a couple of years, and and had the exact same problem, where to find good wood for joinery. So I trust, Earl, that your question was addressed. Here's another, Jordan again is following up on hand tools, mentioning that you brought your hand planes from a man, and he was under the impression that you then turned around and sold them to your students. He's asking, is that supplier still around, and what's their name?
Right. Let's see. Yeah, there's these planes. Let's see. Most this the name of the blacksmith is Yamamoto. All these planes back in the 80s, when I first started getting them, I was getting them through Moritoshi, which was Mori, who had a Japanese guy that came over, excuse me, and he knew these people and were ordering them for me. And then now I'm getting them through Suzuki. She carries all those, and has a very good relationship with them. I think they still make 3 grades of planes. The one that I get, like I use a 48 millimeter a lot. It's much more convenient. It's easier to sharpen. Sometimes I use a 70 millimeter. That's the width of the blade. But his blades are really good. This is the his like regular blade. This is the second grade. This is one his grandfather made. I'm talking about the youngest guy's grand. And this is a Sume, S-U-M-E-I. It's a little higher quality. Then he makes it even more higher quality, more expensive thing. But geez, it's great. You know, I mean, I kind of, you know, Suzuki takes care of all that.
Yeah, this guy's concentrating on making planes. He's not running a retail business.
She's
the distributor.
Yeah, and I mean, my students, you know, I recommend my students buy that plane because for the price, you won't get a better plane. And again, part of the problem with doing this is not a casual thing, is that you got to put some cash out to get some tools, right? But I mean, if you start setting up a machine shop, you're way out of the league of what you need to buy a couple of good tools. So, you know, buying a few good tools is better than a whole bunch of half-ass stuff, you know, because that's never going to work. You pay what you get for, whether you know what you're getting for or not. And, you know, I trust her. I always trusted Fred Damson at Japan Woodworker when they were in Alameda. They're gone now, and they're a catalog company out of West Virginia. Bless their heart. And, you know, in Hita, those guys were all reputable people, and they weren't going to sell you crap and we have feedback coming back that he sold me some crap. So I always, you know, I trusted those people. And if you got any problems, you can take them back. But I've never had, you know, I've never really had any problems with what I felt I got what I paid for.
Here's a related question from a colleague of mine, Janet Barton, who's also a volunteer down at Shin Park in Fremont.
How are you? Haven't talked to you in a long time.
And she says, at 3 of our historic parks in Fremont, trees are cut down when they die. Is there, a lot of old trees in these old parks.
Yeah, really, beautiful.
Is there a network of people who would be interested in these trees? Some are quite unusual, others not. 100-year-old chestnuts, yews, cherries, silk oaks, poplars, cedars. She's in, you know, are they interested in the wood, that is, rather than being chipped, you know?
Oh yeah, that's terrible. You know, I used to know a couple of guys that did urban logging. I got some fantastic big slabs from them that they go out and, you know, take it out of somebody's yard. You know, maybe a big walnut, or I know they got I got some big slabs of Atlas cedar from them. I still got in the back there that were just luscious stuff that you'd never go find in other. I wish there was some way to take care of that, because I know that wood should not be chipped up. I mean, if people knew what the value of that wood was, you know, and you had somebody that knew how to mill it up and store it or move it around, that's usually the problem. But a lot of times now, some of these guys got portable mills. Instead of hauling the log around, they pull up and saw it into chunks that they can move around, or, you know, maybe even resaw the whole thing right there. So I don't know. Well, there should be something to put up on eBay or something that there's trees or wood or something available. There must be, you know, some of the woodworking clubs around. I mean, there's Bay Area woodworkers, there's Diablo woodworkers that are out in Pleasanton. There's Santa Cruz woodworkers. I mean, there's got to be somebody in those groups that would want to deal with that, because that's a good resource. And I mean, in the Bay Area, every tree in the world grows here. I mean, you got everything from camphor to paulownia to silk oak and all kinds of stuff. You don't even know what it is. It's just an ornamental tree, and then you find out, oh, well, that was a Japanese pagoda tree, or, you know, some kind of thing you never see in a lumber yard.
Yeah, I would imagine, you know, Janet, of course, has multiple memberships in different organizations. That's how we all know her. And I would imagine the organization that has a membership and newsletters and stuff might be the International Society of Arboriculture.
That might work. I mean, there's North American Timber Framers.
Oh Oh, yeah.
They might be in, I mean, you know, some of the, she's talking about is probably incredible cabinetry or interior wood, not necessarily timber framing structures, maybe so, you know, depends on what, you know, the size and all that.
Yeah, even some lumber yards might be interested in this. if they
There's
have
gotta
a
be, I
custom.
mean, you know, as aware as the Bay Area is about environmental things, there must be somebody, but it's not gonna be probably a big lumber yard, right? They got their sources and where they comes in and it's all set and regulated and it's all, you know, but when you get into all these, there's one tree or there's, you know, whatever the different things were. So, yeah, I don't know, that'd be a good thing to have some sources for that, because it's really a shame to, I mean, I see the city doing that. And I had a friend that got the, one of the guys that used to do the urban logging, they got the privilege to take down all these street trees in Sacramento. And I mean, they were huge and beautiful and wonderful. I mean, they'd grown too big and were digging up the sidewalks or just too big into where they were planted. And, you know, we got some incredible, you know, lumber out of there. So right now, I don't know anybody, but, you know, well,
The
maybe I
person
do.
to ask Janet would probably be Eric Fulmer, who used to have the Tree Wolf Company. He had a portable mill.
And I'm thinking too, Michael Cran, guy down in West Oakland who's with Kizaruka, he's got a whole big milling thing there and he mills up a lot of big trees. So maybe him. I have your website, I have your email. I'll see if I'll give you his email and you can contact him and see, because, you know, he's a young guy who's into all that and, you know, milling. He's got a great mill set up and big warehouse and the whole thing. He might be the one. So I'll send you his email address.
That's the thing, you get involved and joining group endeavors, and next thing you know, you're benefiting from this kind of cooperation. Yeah.
Yeah, it takes more than a village.
So Jay, after we take a break, one of our participants asked if you can show some examples of some of the things that you or your students have built.
Okay, I got a whole bunch of joinery I was gonna finally get to here.
Oh, well, let's take a break first.
So yeah, so what I was trying to do was lay in some history and some, you know, some of the evolution of the practicality of where the tools came from and how those tools advanced with their skills and their engineering and their designing and all that. And what that's involved with is what these tools do to a piece of wood. So yeah, let's take a break here a minute and then we'll come back and yeah, I got a good 45 minutes, a good half an hour of joints to show you. So
5 minutes.
okay, one more little item I want to throw in here. When they build a temple, all the surfaces are planed, and when they plane a beam, they have to have a plane blade as wide as the beam. I had this one specially made. You don't find these that often. This is 6 soon, which is about 7.5 inches. I got a die there, but I haven't made the die yet. But I had my friend Jim Blaufelt laminate this blade up, and it's just really, you know, really an incredible opportunity to have this. You see, it's all handmade. He laminated it together, and then when you look at the hollow grind in here, you can see it wasn't ground, it was scraped out, because you can see kind of chatter marks from where the scraper went. Again, that scraper is kind of like a draw knife, and it scrapes it out. So when it's annealed and as soft as it's going to be, it's like a piece of plastic at that point. Scrape it out, shape it, do whatever you're going to, and then when he tempers it, it gets hard, and you wouldn't be able to do that when it was hard. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to having time to get this in a die and see how it works. I mean, not a lot of these around. This is a specialty guy, a guy that they call it to do that for the temples, wouldn't be your regular carpenter. They're guys who are just specialists in planing. And you wouldn't think so, but it's really an incredible, you know, I mean, how far you can take this is amazing. But to have a piece of steel that's like that, I mean, this is an American guy. So the other thing too is, a few years ago, I got a picture from Mr. Kamijo, who's head of Japanese Kizarukai. He's been here a few times and we've had an opportunity to work with him. and he's one of those guys who's a planing specialist. I think he taught at a trade school in Japan or something, but really incredible guy in planing. He just had the hands, right? I mean, you go to see him work and it's just like so smooth. And I want to do it like that, right? That's what you see when you see somebody doing it. So anyway, I got a picture from him where he had a plane like this that had 5 blades in it. Impossible, right? So I thought about that. So lockdown came, I had time in the shop, nothing to do, so I decided I wanted to make one. So I glued up some dies, some blocks together, I laid mine out, and I only did 3 because that's enough. But you know, again, when you're planing, this surface, and this surface, and that surface got to be in the same flat plane. The blades got to be adjusted right, so to get all 3 of them set up in planing is really hard. It's probably the most impractical thing I've ever made, but it was a challenge, you know, and I did it, and I'm going to spend more time making it work and seeing what happens, because I only know there's one other one that's got 5 in it other than this one. So, I mean, you know, this is something that's not really usable, but it's a challenge if you're like challenging yourself, right? So I got a little work to do here with planes. So that's kind of where my fun is these days. I'm still working a little bit. So what I want to also recommend here is some reading material. I put out the first Japanese woodworking introduction in 1988. I remember when we made this, we had a debate on whether to go VHS or beta. Now you can't even find a machine that plays this thing, you know. So anyway, that came out then. He said that was about after 15 years of work. I wrote this shoji book. Before that, it was published by Kodansha. This was the first shoji book written in the English language, and it's kind of a how-to and design things and some about the tools. I wrote this to help people know how to make them and the fun it is. It's such an incredible design project, but also for customers to know how to judge what the quality of the screens were. I've been making shoji for a long time. I don't think I've ever made 2 the same, because to me, I go look at where they're going in. There's something in the house, proportions, or some kind of a thing that gives me some kind of idea about what I want to do to, you know, make the design, mostly in the Kamiko pattern. I don't really do all those fancy things, but you know, just standard stuff. This was a complete Japanese joinery book. I think that's probably one of the better joinery books. I worked on this as a contributing editor. It's actually 2 books put together. I worked on the first one, which is about layout and tools. The thing that's good about this, there's a lot of explanation, but also, you know, sometimes in the back, they actually show you what the joints, where they go in a house. So it's really an interesting, you know, way to study this and see where they go. Plus, you know, there's a lot of, you know, there's the layout for the hip rafter with the 2 Cata beams going underneath it. So, you know, it shows you how to lay out hip rafters and all that. If you can figure it out of this book, you're better than me. But anyway, it's really interesting to show you a lot of design. You know, there's the barge board in the front and how they hook that together. You know, it's just, there's a lot of books out about this, plus, you know, a lot of other things. But yeah, this was, I think this is a very helpful book because the front part's really explanatory about what you're trying to do. I did 2 DVDs myself. This one's 2 hours about joinery, hand tools called Connections, which is joinery is wood to wood connections. This is about how to do that real time. I go through a lot of the basic kind of things I'm going to talk about now. This one is a 2-hour DVD on taking a plane out of a box and getting it to make shavings and doing all that stuff. You know, again, I get contacted by a lot of people in the United States, all over the world. I sold these things to India, to Cuba, to Chile, to Switzerland to, geez, I even sent some to Japan. So anyway, yeah, but trying to explain what all that is. This one is one I did a few years ago with Woodwork magazine. I think they're out of business now, but this is a 3-hour DVD. I'm not sure where you could get it, but I go through a lot of stuff, and so that might be helpful too. The other book, I think it's really the Bible of Japanese, at least house constructions, is this book done by Heinrich Engel, German guy. I bought this book in 1981 or 2, and it was $57.50. Now I think it's probably out of print and worth $200 or $300. But again, you got the German mind going through and outlining. I mean, there must be 10 different house constructions in here with the floor plans, and then he goes into a lot of the drawings of what the joinery is and just the history and the possibilities of roof layouts and all that stuff. So I mean, again, if you're looking for a comprehensive book, if this was the basis of what you understood, you'd understand a lot of stuff. So that was something that I would recommend if you could find it. Like I said, I'm sure it's out of print now. I don't know why books like this, they let go out of print. The information's not out of date. I mean, they must have made their money off it. Okay, now the joinery part here. How I approach these shapes, I'm using a chisel and a Ryoba, right? Those 2 tools. That's what I call 5 reductive processes. Again, you probably can't read this. There are 5 processes that I use with a chisel and a Ryoba. The first one is the most basic and organic, which is splitting. A lot of times you can split stuff and remove. Again, we're reducing a shape into some other shape, right? So with a chisel, you got splitting. You got mortising, which is chiseling. Mortise is chiseling across the grain and digging a hole, right? The other thing you do with the chisel is paring, which is going across the grain to flatten out something that's been sawed or to clean up a surface. So usually you're going across the grain, paring, vertical across the grain, vertical to dig the hole, right? So that's mortising. So you got splitting, you got mortising, and you got paring. And with a Ryoba, you got cross cut and rip cut. So every shape you're going to make is going to be a combination of 2 or 3 or 4, maybe all 5 of those processes. So for me, what that helps me do is that when I look at a joint or I look at a picture of a joinery, something in a book or something, I can have some idea about how I would attack removing that material, right? So that's part of each joint we look at. There's a set of processes that give you a start and a finish. So usually you want to do the hard part first, which means usually you're doing the mortising or something first. You want to do, if you got 2 pieces that fit, one of them's harder than the other, you want to do the hard one first. It's easier to make the tenon fit the mortise than it is make the mortise fit the tenon. So I got a layout. I want to hit that layout. It shouldn't really matter, but I always do the mortise first in case something gets out of control or out of shape. Then I can adjust the tenon to make that fit what I want. If you've already sawed the tenon, all of the process is working on getting the mortise to fit the tenon, and that's the wrong way to go about doing that. I usually like to think about compound joints from the inside out, so I don't take off the outside first and lose all the layouts. Because a lot of times what you're doing on the inside, obviously there's no way to lay that out. So if you're doing a mortise through something, you want to do that first before you saw the cheeks off the tenon. Otherwise you lost all your layout lines. So some of this is just, I don't know, common sense. working yourself into a corner and having to figure out what to do better next time. You got to be self-correcting. Nobody's going to come around behind you and fix it for you unless your mom's following you around. So the first one we look at here is a bridle joint. So again, this is poplar. Poplar works really good. It's a good stable wood. It's got even density in the end. Cuts good, holds up, good compression, the whole thing. So this is a lap joint called a half lap because each part's cut in half, right? It lays over its hand like handshaking. So when you're looking at this joint, what holds it together is the compression of this piece going into this slot and this piece going into this slot, right? So when you get the right compression, you can't pull that apart, right? So, I mean, I wouldn't load something up like this without hooking it together. But this is a simple shape. So how we make these shapes is this is one of the basic techniques here. You notice these things move a little as the weather changes. That's for me. I like to do all the planing in the morning when the moisture's in because the wood's in much better shape than in the afternoon when the sun's all out and the air is too hot. So how we make this shape? You can see we got a good accurate layout. If you can look here at the bottom, what you do first is make saw cut, rip cuts, cross cuts, right? Second thing you're gonna do is go in with your chisel and pop all those loose by splitting. I'll give you kind of a rough surface. These edges here will be really clean because you sawed them. Then what you do is come back and pare and flatten all that down to your center line from the layout. Same thing on this one. You got a center line on the layout. You can see the cross cuts. You come back, you pop those out, and then you split this out. So you can pop them out or you can pare them out. Popping them out's easier. Then you just pare it. So again, the tight measurement should squeak together like that, and a little tapping should put that together. This is one of the basic elements. Easy. You're going to use it a lot in different things. This one, I don't know if you can see this one. Same half lap, but it's got little dovetails on each corner. Why would you do that? I got no idea. Again, it's a challenge. See if you can do it. See how your accuracy is. See if you're visualizing. If you don't check yourself, you're always kind of wondering, well, you did good. Okay, if you didn't, let's do it better next time, right? So again, there's all these simple things that get added on to make other more interesting or decorative kind of things. So that's two pieces. When you got three pieces, all these three pieces are different. There's the top piece, looks like that. There's the center piece, looks like that. There's the bottom piece, looks like that. You see all three pieces are different, but when they go together, see that fills in that slot. So what you got left is this cross piece right there, which fits in there. That crotch in the middle is where those little points go, right? So again, start with the simple, get your sawing so it's accurate, then go to something a little harder and see as you add these things. The problem is that you start accumulating error, and then at the end it doesn't fit and you got to go back and rework it. That's when the problem starts. You usually overwork it or cut the wrong thing off. So while you got the layout on your pieces, you want to make your dry fit work so it fits good, nice and tight, right? So again, this is this thing, a lot of times they're little like popsicle sticks done this way. They're in some of those decorative kind of Kamiko patterns. Second one is bridle joint. This one I call the second one because the first one, this is kind of a pedagogical approach, which means you make one thing and after you put something else, you get something else, and you keep adding to it. So this is like what we did for the lap joint. Chop, 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 pair those out. You got two of them on one piece. That makes the top piece, right? So the other piece that it fits down into is right there. So our compression is that this piece against these two right there. That's what's going to hold it in there. Now, this piece, you got a rip cut and a rip cut. It gives you the size. What I do here is I mortise down, say, half a quarter of an inch, and then I split the end, that piece comes out. Chisel, mortise a little more, split that piece, it comes out. You don't chisel the whole thing. It's already been cut from the grain fiber going that way. So as you do these things, you got to realize where the grain is and where the strength is and all that kind of stuff. But again, so I got rip cuts, I got mortising, I got splitting, and then I got paring to get everything nice and flat. Right? That should be fairly obvious. So again, when this goes in, right, the compression's against right there. So as this goes in, usually you're loading this joint with gravity. You wouldn't do it upside down like that, right? So if this is in gravity, it could be little pieces, it could be big pieces. It doesn't matter because you've got a lot of binding surface. It's stronger than a mortise and tenon because you got 4 binding surfaces instead of just 2 in the middle. Right, this is a mortise and tenon, then the tenon would have been in the middle and it would have been reversed. This is a really strong, usable joint. Okay, now take that one. The next thing that I thought, well, what's the vulnerable part of this joint is if this piece gets twisted, you might split down this way, right? So what I did was I housed the bridle joint, which means it doesn't come all the way through. I put a little stub tenon on the top. So when this drives down, it catches a little mortise in there and that locks this and makes it stronger. Right? Same compression. I just added that little stub tenon, which goes into a little mortise at the top there. Something I came up with while I was working out the bonsai garden doing things, because we were using this kind of joinery to build all the display modules down there. Mortise and tenon. This is house mortise and tenon because it doesn't come through with a pin holding it together. So the tenon comes up inside. You can see I got the layout. The tenon comes in far to the layout line, and there's where the key goes through, and it's a draw pin, which means that the pin hole through the tenon is a little lower. So when the pin goes through, it puts pressure and pulls this shoulder up tight to the mortise there, right? That's really important that you get that good and tight. If it's loose, it doesn't work. This joint, this series of joints, these are mortise and tenons. This is kind of a model of a temple railing where you have a bigger piece, you have an open piece, you have a stringer, and then the piece up here is different or smaller than down there. A lot of times this one's round or what. This is the top beam right there. So what's holding this in on the foot part here is a through mortise and tenon with wedges in it. That won't come off. What this joint is double. The bottom one has 2 tenons. The top piece has 1 that goes in and it's tapered. So as you drive this down, it spreads the bottom. So this won't come off. Right, again, it's set up for wedge this way, but when it's tight like that, it won't come out, right? That's another double, 1 mortise, 2 tenons on this one, 1 in the middle, and it spreads that tenon out against the end grain of the mortise. That's what makes it tight. The joint at the top is called a hell joint. What that means is you've got a tenon coming up here, you've got a mortise. In that tenon and mortise, you're making 2 curve cuts and putting wedges. So when you drive this down on there, the wedges spread and open up the tenon to become like a dovetail in there, and that's why this won't come off. It's called a hell joint because if you don't have everything calculated right, it's hell, you can't fix it, right? If the wedges are too long, it won't go all the way down. If the wedges are too short, it won't be tight. So again, all these joints depend on your accuracy and your sharpness and your layout and your 3D visualization. You know, most people don't have a lot of 3D imagination. Starting simple and adding these things on, then finally it clicks. Oh, this, I see where I've had that happen to me mostly with splicing joints. I was really intimidated by splicing joints. It was those long rip cuts. We don't have any cross cuts, you know, usually not that long and easy and you can fix it, but long rip cuts are really a trip. So that gets into splicing joints, which there must be hundreds of them. This one is called the the Tsugi is splicing joints. So you have end-to-end joints, and then you have 90-degree joints. And there are some angle ones, but mostly it's vertical 90 degrees or end-to-end. This is the Kanawatsugi joint, which to me is the strongest joint the Japanese use. You can use it vertically in a post. You can use it as a beam. What happens, these two pieces, again, you got cogs and things that all fit together that stabilize it, right? This cut fits in and slides down, and when it slides into place, there's wedges or a pin that goes in there that pushes these two pieces together, locking them together, I'd say about as strong as the piece is together, because all this compression is against the end grain of the mortise, right? If you got pressure this way, bending down from a load, it's compressed against these two ends. If you do it this way, put a load on it, you're going to split right down here because all the pressure is against the end grain. So this joint's loaded up like that. This is a structural joint, probably one of the most usable joint. If you knew one splicing joint, this would be the one you'd want to use. It's really strong and holds up good. Some of these other ones, the ones that I start off with is this bird beak joint. Right? This is 8 rip cuts. When we're doing rip cuts with the saw, this is the joint we practice on. Right? What you got here for the layout is two rectangles. These two rectangles got to be exactly the same or the angles they won't fit. So that's a layout thing, right? So you got that. Then you got your diagonal from that point to this point and runs from the other side on the other side. So you get like a bird beak, not really, right? But all your binding surfaces, so you got 2 of them. They got to be the same length so you get the same angle or they won't fit up. And it's really hard to, you know, fix it if it's not the right angle, because one's this way and that way, it just gets worse. You know, plus you got to rip down the middle here to get, you know, to get a nice seam. So you want all that to look good. So when that goes together, it's got a key. This is a Japanese thing. They use these little keys set at a diagonal, right? Instead of just a pin through it. So what happens is you put a tapered, looks kind of like this. You got a tapered pin that fits in that hole. As you drive it down, it's getting wider and pushing the two pieces together. That little thing right there would hold incredible amount of tension of keeping this from pulling apart. So these aren't glue joints or nails, or, you know, sometimes they pin them like the mortise and tenon here. There's a mechanical pin that holds it together. There's keys like this that hold all the splicing joints together. And then there are wedges, which I use on the end of the tenons that come through to hold the door frames together. I do that. I make shoji and doors this way, exposed in. I can chisel the wedge out, take the door apart, refix the screen in here. If it was glued together, I'd have to make a whole new frame. This way lets me take the whole thing apart. Looks like that. Right? So this is a sample piece my class does. We do 4 different joints, a simple joint, like this one. You see that? This one just has the tenon coming through on the bottom half. This one's the same bottom half, but it's got a spline at the top. That locks into the mortise at the top and makes more stability for that. These are just little stub tenons. The one in the bottom here, it's the same as this one. Again, the tenon's always on the inside. I add a little haunch at the bottom. And what happened with this one, it's because I got a panel in here. I set the tenon down the depth of the groove of the panel, because you can't have a tenon with a groove cut in it. So what's different in this one is the tenon is down about a bow and a half from here, so I can put the groove in without destroying the tenon. See that right there? It's set down enough so the groove is right there where you can see where it goes into the panel like that. It's not grooved. So these are the curves where the wedges go in. This is the one without the set in.
Oh, this is crazy.
No, I can't be way over there. No. Anyway, that's just, so again, this shows you the keys, where the wedges drive in. So all these have little pockets and everything to catch. The funny one, the hard one, the more expensive one is this joint with a miter in the corner. So depending on what joint I use, that depends on kind of the price of what the screen or the shoji is going to be. That with Kamiko and all the other stuff. But again, you can see this little piece here has a miter in it. Tenon is set down so you can see that the groove doesn't interfere with the tenon, and then it goes back that way. So all the layouts and all that stuff get a little more complicated, but that's what you're here to do work for. So this is a model of a corner of a joint I'm going to make for my new front door. I got a big miter here. I've got the tenon set down like that one. This miter is much bigger. The other one was smaller. I've got panels in there, and then the panels have got these mullions that go across that are mortised in there. So even with a small panel, when you put something like that in there, right? I got a bridle joint at the top, and I got a mortise and tenon at the bottom. So that's really going to help stiffen up that door, even though it's going to be stiff enough, just with that. So I've got a nice bevel here. I think it's going to be a beautiful door. I can't wait till I get some time in my free time, I'm going to do something like that. So splicing joints. The other one is used a lot is a joint like this. You up here or down there. It's like this, which again has this tongue that goes in with these two keys, right? So what you got looks like this. You got a male and female, right? You got cogs and tenons to hold everything in place from warping and twisting. These two merge, and when they go together, you put your keys in there, and that tightens it all together. Sometimes on big things, this tenon will be a floating tenon because you're losing, on a big timber, this thing might be 1.5 feet of lumber you'd be wasting. So it's easier to groove this out on both sides and put a floating tenon in there. So that kind of brings us to this thing. This is a post. This could be like a floor beam. So you got the post, you got the floor beam that floats on this piece, and the tension is, the weight is held on this stub tenon, and these two are stabilizers to keep it from twisting. Excuse me. This has a housed sliding dovetail, fits in the hole at the bottom and slides up in there. That's what holding that in there. That's the tongue that did. So when this piece goes in, that's that plug at the bottom that fills the bottom hole, so that can't come out. You put these two together, you put the key in there, that keeps this from coming out, and there's your floor joist held up that way. All right. Same thing, except when you're doing like a tea house, you'd be working in logs, right? Nice clean logs. You do the same thing. You wouldn't want to have a tenon or something on it. You want to see that nice graceful log right there. So it's got the same kind of thing. There's your slot in the tenon, and you got this dovetail. I think it grew in there. There's your dovetail that fits in. All right, fits right in there, slides right up in there. Slick. This piece goes in there. Put your keys in there, and there's what it's kind of look like. Slick. So again, all these simple things just get added in, and you get more complicated and more pretty and more useful with all these other adjustments you add to it. Here's kind of an architectural interior splicing joint.
Oh, hold on, I got you on the other camera there. I'm back.
All right. All you see is a couple of lines. This one is split on the diagonal. Right. They lap up, the diagonal is cut on the edge of the piece so you don't see it. You got the little stub tendons in your pocket. The hardest part of this joint is cutting that thing out because you can't, it's ingrained and you have a hard time getting in there. But again, all these things have to fit right. If there's any slop in there, then it won't work. So that one usually is that way, or you might put a key in there. I know I worked one time with a Japanese carpenter over Japan, woodworker, and he did a joint like this. So I asked him, I said, how do you keep this together? You got a key or a pin? And he looked at me and he said, glue. You grew it together. So it was like a glue joint. So that was the last thing I was expecting him to say. I mean, this guy was, oh, it's a glue joint. What? You grew it together, right? So there you go. There is a little glue once in a while, but not usually. The other thing that I got here, which is kind of a full scale mock-up. Whoa. This is a house beam. This is the ground. You'd have some kind of a foundation, probably packed rock or something. If you do this now, you need to have a pier with a grade beam, and you've got a stainless steel bolt that comes up through here. This one is just, you see, I got this on it with just a lag bolt going up. So if this was on a foundation, the rebar or the threaded bolt would come up out of the foundation and go up in here, and you'd probably have a pocket with a nut that you tied in for earthquake proofing to tie this down onto the rock so it didn't come undone. That's what code would want you to do to get through with all this. So this is, again, a house post sitting on a foundation. This is the floor beams. So what you got here, let's see if I can take these apart. These aren't really puzzle parts that go together and come apart that easy. They do. So this one, you can see it's like that other one. You got this slot here. You got your haunches, and your haunches at the bottom that are carrying the weight and the stability. You got this floating tenon that goes all the way through with the keys that go in from the top. So once this goes together, maybe not today. And these posts would probably be on the Japanese scale is a kin, which is a 6x6, which is more or less 2 tatami mats. They don't work on a 4x8 sheet of plywood. It's usually within those modules. And that's where the post and the frames and all the shoji all fit with the tatami mats and everything fit together. You got those there, you put your keys in there. So, I mean, one of the advantages of the joinery, wood to wood joinery, there's no metal in here or glue that's going to oxidize or get eaten up by bacteria and change the shape or make it all loose. This is here till the wood rots away, right? Obviously it lasts for a long time. This is how old temples and old farmhouse, this is how it's put together to last, right? So, it's an ingenious way of putting together little pieces and being able to connect the puzzle and figure out what it is that you actually need to do. This is another big splicing joint called the gooseneck or a hammerhead or a snakehead splicing joint. This is driven down into there with the tapered head, which again, this is strong because all the compression is against the end grain of the mortise right here, right? driving that down. This angle here is usually angled a little, so as you drive it to the bottom, it tightens up. So I mean, again, you know, great stuff, lasts forever. The other interesting thing with the joint that didn't really make much sense, so actually I made it a couple times. This one we used on the post down at the bonsai garden. It's a splicing joint with all this compression against the end grain here. And you know, you drive it down, you can't hardly get it out. You usually got to drive something in there to get it out. But again, all these things work because you got sharp chisels, you got good sawing technique, and you kind of visualize and you understand what the shapes are going to look like when you get done. I got a lot more joints I can show you, but I got to open up some time for questions.
Oh, sure. Jay, here, Earl's been waiting a while on this one. Is there a piece of furniture or a building that is an archetype for displaying Japanese joinery?
A building that's archetype. Well, if you go to most Japanese gardens, you go to the tea garden in San Francisco and you look at that big main entry gate there, you're going to see a lot of interesting joinery that you don't see because they hide all the good stuff. One other joint that I wanted to show you was, hold on, this one. Right, so once you recognize some of the shapes and you know what's in there. This one is one you'd see on the entry at that big gate down there. You got the main post. It goes up this way and the roof is here. These are like outriggers that help stabilize that. So you'll see this post and you'll see this. This may not stick through, but what's in there is a half a dovetail, right? It fits in. You got a double, you know, you got the dovetail that fits in. See, there's the layout. So the dovetail goes in and sets down into that crotch, right? And then you got two wedges. I don't know where the other one is. The wedges go in as they drive in. They're bypassing and get bigger as you drive them together, which again increases the compression against the end grain. The strongest right angle joint that I know of. Stronger than a pin, stronger than wedges in the end. Plus you can knock it down real easy. This is a joint that I saw a picture of this in a book of Chinese furniture at the time of Confucius. So what's that, 2,500 years ago? Joint still works, not obsolete. What it's used in Japan for is like, you got a timber frame building, all the studs in between here would be hooked up with these series of nukis with all these wedges, and that's what puts shear into a Japanese building. They don't have plywood shear walls. This becomes the shear wall, right? So what this does, they weave bamboo in here, fill it with mud, and that becomes the outside wall. So what you see in all those beautiful, nice, clean white walls, underneath that is probably a structure like that. So really, this is called shitashi kama. Half a dovetail with wedge. There's a couple of different configurations of this, but that's the easiest and the strongest one I know of.
Let's see if there's any questions lost in chat. Nope. Okay, Jay, that's it for questions for the moment.
Okay. There we go.
Oh, I had a question for you.
Okay.
Taking you back to burnishing, are there some species of wood that have burnish better, maybe have more oil in them, perhaps?
Yeah, there's some, most of the Port Orford doesn't need it because it's got enough natural oils. Red cedar is really kind of a dry wood. So what I do is I get it done. I've already planed it. I've oiled it. I use an organic oil. And then when I burnish it, the pressure and the friction from the planings, the bonding surface, heats that oil up and puts a transparent coating on there that doesn't look like anything, and it repels water. Most woods come up with a real sheen. I mean, it's really surprising. I don't know if you can see this or not. This is a piece of Paulownia wood. I don't know if you can see the sheen change in there as I'm moving around. That's chatoins, which is the shifting of light that's coming. Because again, when you plane this off, there's no surface. When you sand it, it scratches. This is a clear surface that goes down and picks up all the grain fibers that are reflecting this wood. So when you look at this knot, the whole thing moves depending on how the light, and that's from the sheen and the burnishing of the plane. And I mean, this is Paulownia Kiri wood, which is a very soft wood, kind of like balsa wood, but it's what they use all the they make all the storage boxes for scrolls, tea bowls, kimonos. A lot of the tansu for kimono are made out of Paulownia because it doesn't have any sap in it. This was brought from China into the South, I don't know, early 1800s as a ornamental tree. It grows up and has these beautiful purple flowers on it. They just flowered not long ago, right? Well, they got out of the gardens and got into the woods and they naturalized and they grow really fast. The Japanese were over here in the 50s flying over the forest to pick out the trees they wanted, and they saw these trees blooming. They told the guy, we want those trees. The guy said, you don't want that wood, it's too soft. Well, shit, they've been using this wood for 1,000 years. They plant a tree when the girl's born, and when she gets married, they make a tansu for out of the tree because it'll grow that fast. But it's really an incredible wood. Got to be really sharp tools to work it, but everything gets a sheen to it. Curly maple, it looks like it's radioactive sometimes. So, it brings out stuff in wood that you never see by sanding, no matter how fine, because sanding's always scratches. This is no scratches. It's an impervious sheared surface that's been burnished. So, I don't know if you can do any better than that.
Would you care to comment on the ability to burnish some of the more commonly available woods in the southeastern U.S.? I'm assuming it'd be pine. Here on the West Coast, it's Douglas fir. Redwood is still available for a while. Yeah. And western red cedars or yellow cedar from Alaska.
Everything, I can't say I've planed everything successfully, but I've planed things that looked like they were going to be really hard because of curly grain or something that came out just really beautiful. I planed everything from wingate, which is like a piece of coal. I mean, it's just the hardest stuff I've ever planed in terms of brittle hard, but the surface it gets is just incredible. I'd planed up a job and I had a piece sitting in the corner of my shop, and a customer came over and wanted something made. And the first thing he did was see that piece of wood. I want it made out of that. And I went, oh no, because the sharpening you got to do, that stuff, anything that grows in a tropical rainforest is either so nasty bugs don't eat it, or it's so full of stuff, grit and stuff, right? So there's nothing really nice that, nothing creamy that comes out of those forests. So just all that grit and stuff in there just eats your blade up. So it's a lot of sharpening to maintain that blade edge, because that's where the surface comes from. So yeah, I always recommend, if you're going to make something, get, cut on it, chisel it, plane it, see how it works before you start laying out and doing all your real work on your expensive wood, just so you know what you're getting into. Because, even after years of experience, I still do that, and I kind of understand what's going to happen, but it's just part of the process that if I don't do that and something happens later, I should have done that. I would have known X, Y, or Z, or whatever showed up later. So, to me, it's a preparation for your job, visualizing, understanding it, but understanding what the materials you're going to use and how they're going to go together to really, you invest all that time in there, and it's more than getting a set of plans and running it through machines and gluing it together. I mean, that's okay too if you want to do that. This is a whole nother challenge.
So could you comment on the potentials for things like burnishing, or for that matter, labor intensive, but simple materials technology such as joinery, in cases where people just don't have a ton of cash to throw at a problem, or where the environmental toll of using petrochemicals versus furnishing. You get the picture, kind of the appropriate technology throughout the world.
Yeah. Well, like I said, you need a few basic tools, and you need a lot of practice. A lot of that practice is sharpening. You know, just getting used to all that. Everything, all the joinery, what you need for finishing is at least one plane. And the time you put in on a plane, we've done a lot of Kizurukai webcams that guys talk about setting up the planes and all the stuff they do. Usually when we do planes in my class, we spend maybe 4 classes working on it all, getting it set up, tuning it, and actually making shavings. First thing you want to do is make shavings, but you're not making shavings. You're trying to get the surface of the wood flat. So, you know, there's a lot of tweaking and things you need to understand to do that. But, you know, start and see what happens. I mean, you don't know if you don't try. It may not be as difficult as it seems sometimes. Other times, simple things might look simple, but it's not so simple. Might look easy, but not so simple. So, you know, get there and try. That's what you're for there. That's the fun, you know, figuring this out. I myself hate to give people the answer because I know what my adventure was, the wonderment of finding out things. Oh, hell, this actually worked. Oh, look what I did that and that worked. Oh, that didn't work. Try something else. I mean, you know, it's all those things. I didn't have somebody telling me the answer. Because you get the answer and you don't know how you got there. You only know the answer. There's all this stuff that you should have learned getting to the answer that you need to know why that's the answer. So, you know, try yourself. You're working in the shop, it doesn't work, put it in the fireplace, do it again. You know, there's nobody judging you because you didn't do it right the first time. I don't know anybody, any Japanese carpenter who told me they started off good. You start off terrible, embarrassing sometimes. You think, oh, I'm a grown person, I should do better than that. These are skills we're not accustomed to. Our body isn't trained to deal with this kind of patience. This is not something you're multitasking, but it's all located right here.
So does it help to be in a dojo or a Kizurukai in a group to learn?
I think there's
these
a lot to learn.
attitudes?
I think there's a lot to learn from videos and books and DVDs and stuff. But I know with my students, the ones that I've had to come to work with me on my jobs professionally, putting them through all the repetition of doing it made more sense than any book or video they ever saw, because you're running into those consistent challenges, maintaining your sharp edge. Your conditioning goes out of warp over the day because of the heat and the temperature changes. So again, the more focus you get on it, the smaller increments you can change to get down to micron level stuff. That doesn't happen. Best one I've ever done was 9 microns. I thought that was pretty good for a white boy.
Well, hey, we've gone over, but that's because we've only just begun.
We've only just begun.
So, you know, we are very lucky to have Jay Van Arsdale, not only because he's a great craftsperson, but also because he's totally involved. I mean, he's organized all his students. They're still Daiku Dojo is a club. You know, it's an alumni club, and it's almost like a trade guild. Really, they're all supporting each other. And then Kizurukai,
Yeah,
that's an international network.
That's what we're trying to make Kizurukai now. I think, you know, we were trying to train people and bring them up to speed. There's things in the works that I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about, but we're trying to set up a system of qualifications to set up standards for the repairs done on traditional buildings in this country that aren't going to be done with chop saws and nail guns. We're trying to set up some standard for that because the Japanese want us to take care of our own stuff. I know Chicago asked Japan government for $1 million so they could repair their Japanese buildings they had in some of their parks and stuff. And they're going to do that. So it's up to us. That's what one of the things that Kizurukai is working on in the background, is to set up this kind of a standard in testing. So if some garden in New York or somewhere wants something built, we've got people who are capable of building a fence, a tea house, whatever, because all those jobs are coming around. I mean, all this stuff that was built after the war, you know, is 70 years old now.
Yeah,
Or
and that,
more.
and that generation of
You know,
Japanese Americans who built many of these friendship
aren't gone anymore. I know the guys down in San Jose at the Buddhist temple down there. I mean, I knew all the old guys that, you know, they rebuilt that temple because they knew how to do it. Now, no. You know, and I mean, you know, you see the Japanese come here. Well, they don't want their son to be a carpenter. Sucker needs to be a doctor or an engineer, or, you know, something. You know, so that's, you know, that's why it's weird when I have Japanese people come to my class and I'm telling them about their culture. It doesn't, you know, it's something wrong with that. But again, you know, why should they know about this? We don't, you know, like I say, it was a secret. You know, it's not mainstream pedestrian interest. So, you know, again, people who have lost track with things, this is a good way to get back in touch with yourself through your skills. To me, again, the skill building is a spiritual thing because it's about your character. It's not about religion or any kind of dogma, but it's about the character building of your resiliency and your determination and picking yourself up and doing it again and keep going. I mean, that's part of what you've got this platform to work from. And that's what I always found was really helpful, you know, for me wanting to develop my own skills and understanding that it wasn't something I could read in a book. It was something you got to do.
Well, I guess this is a appropriate time to thank everybody. Jay, the thanks are pouring into you, the compliments. And
Arigato gozaimashita.
Yeah, you'll have to read them all.
Okay.
And once again, we want to thank the generations of people in Oakland, Fukuoka Sister City Association, upon whose shoulders we stood when we wrote this grant, and now we're producing these webinars. And thanks again to the Japan Foundation for providing the budget for this equipment and you know, materials costs and whatnot. Couldn't do it without the Japan Foundation's generosity. And it's a great initiative, and it's open to pretty much any, how would you say, nonprofit organization, public garden, and so forth, to approach them and see the scope of the programs that they'd be willing to support and put out there. So that's pretty visionary stuff. Also want to thank all the related groups that spread the word here. And that's everything from Sakia Living Magazine to the Golden State Bonsai Federation of, you know, bonsai clubs, Suiseki clubs, the Japan U.S. Sister Cities Network. And it's not just Oakland. Everybody's got a sister city in Japan. Thank you all, and to all of you who are still online here, you can forward your webinar invitation to any friend or colleague you know who might be interested in attending. Just spread the word. All people have to do is click on the link.
Arigato.
Yeah, without further ado, we'll see you again in next one scheduled for, next pair scheduled for late September, but more's in the works as long as that generous grant lasts. Okay.
Thank you, Jay Van Arsdale, for an amazing and engaging presentation. Thanks to the original webinar audience for their provocative questions and shared knowledge. The conversation afforded the chance to imbibe the lecture information and form connections with like-minded people. Thanks to the Japanese people who over generations developed the life and living environment that's the subject of these webinars, and who've generously shared this gift with the world. Thanks to the many artists, craftsmen, scholars, and organizations worldwide and here in the USA who've made this known. Notably, the North American Japanese Garden Association, NAJCA, Bonsai and Suiseki clubs, Japan US Sister City Association. Thanks to Sukiya Living Magazine, which shows and tells how this living environment's intangible essence may be realized all over the world with a diversity of tangible materials and forms not necessarily Japanese on their surface. They have universalized this as the Sukiya style living environment. Thanks to the Japan Center for Global Partnership for financial support. Thanks to the Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association for producing these webinars. We invite you to view other recorded webinars in the Japanese style living environment webinar series. Thank you and see you next time.